Thank you very much for coming to Stockholm. You are in precise the right moment because exactly on Saturday, the sun will switch into cold weather and potentially snow next week. So you really spotted it, and I guess you planned it that way. We call it April weather in Stockholm. April weather, it could be either summer or winter. So it's very kind of volatile, you could say. Hopefully, it seems like you are on the right side on that volatility. So welcome to this 77th, I've learned, Economic Policy Parliament, and the event organized by CEPR, SESIFO, and Science Po. And this time hosted here at the Riksbank, the oldest central bank on earth. It's a pleasure to see researchers from across Europe and North America here in the room, and also to welcome those who you are attending from online or virtually. Judging by the program for the conference and the list of participants, this promises to be a stimulating couple of days. An underlying theme of the meeting is the international economic collaboration, or the lack thereof. Looking back through history, we know that changes in international collaborations come in waves, and when turning points comes, they're often brought about by political or even war events. So sadly, the past year has been the return of a full-fledged war on European soil. By the way, very close to Swedish borders. Russia's all unlawful invasion of Ukraine has brought about horrific human suffering, and the situation right now is unstable and dangerous. The war seemed to be far from over. The invasion in February last year naturally prompted many types of responses, not just military. Sanctions, and a key theme today, were quickly put into place and became a key policy tool to put economic pressure on Russia. Given that the war is likely to continue for some time, sanctions will continue to be an important tool for the years to come. Many of the papers being discussed today and tomorrow analyze different aspects of sanctions and what are the effects. How are they best designed, and on what circumstances will they be most effective? These questions are key and extremely relevant. The other paper being presented covered related issues having to do with the causes and effects of conflicts and conflict resolution. The insights gained from the papers being presented today and tomorrow will be important inputs into the ongoing work design of future sanctions and into conflict resolution. The stakes are high. Properly designs these policies shorten conflicts and save lives. What can be more important? One other topic of sanctions, and one thing that I would be interesting to hear from my colleagues taking part in this conference, and though not explicitly on the program, is the question of SWIFT. If I go back exactly 1 year in time, I was called up by one of the main politicians in Sweden asking me, I hear a lot about SWIFT and taking Russia out of SWIFT. What do you think? SWIFT, the international system for transmitting information about financial transactions, suddenly became the household name. And in media and the public debate, expectations came about that cutting Russia off SWIFT would cause a financial collapse in Russia in a short period of time. And I was actually one of them that actually thought that the effects of cutting Russia out of SWIFT would be very, very dramatic. We now know that these expectations were much exaggerated, but do we know why? Another issue that concerned me at the time was the risk that cutting some countries out of SWIFT, a privately state kind of organization, would lead them to construct, the enemy, to construct a parallel system for financial transactions. And hence, that's actually what we have seen to some extent. Thus, these are areas which could benefit from more analysis, since sanctions involve sacrifice on both parts and difficult, which I think my example shows, difficult trade-offs. Care must be taken to make sure that sanctions that are imposed are thus wisely constructed. Unfortunately, while this is probably the first conference as we organized, hopefully not the last, at the Riksbank on these and similar topics, I expected it will not be the last. the field of geoeconomics, and I talked to some people before the conference here, I didn't know the name in geoeconomics, but it seemed to be extremely appropriate given the time we are living in. They're likely to grow in importance over the coming years, and central banks and other policy-making institutions, such as ourselves, will need to adapt to a world that is more unstable than we have been used to. We are learning fast, and we rely to a large extent on the work from you and your colleagues in the research community. So let me hereby thank you all for joining, to coming to Stockholm, and sharing your best thinking on these and other related questions. Once again, very welcome to, as I said, a sunny Stockholm, and enjoy your two-day conference. Thanks.
Thank you very much.
My name is Clemens Fußt. I'm the director of CESIFO, and I would just like to thank you for hosting us here, also in the name of the other organizations organizing. This is very important for us. We are trying to bring academic research to the policy debate, and we do benefit very much from the feedback, what you just said about SWIFT. We benefit very much from the discussions, and thank you again for hosting us, and a big thank you also to your team. The cooperation has really been excellent. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Enjoy.
Just one word to add. I'm Charles Wiplows, and I'm here on behalf of CPR. So on behalf of CPR, I want to thank you very much for hosting that. And I want to congratulate you for being so good at dealing with uncertainty that you brought us here just between two snowfalls. That's very impressive. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you very much.
Okay, so I will soon leave the word to our chair, Pierre Cahuc, for the first session. Just some practical information before we start. First of all, we're at the central bank. As you have noticed, security is tight as at most central banks. So there are some rules we need to follow. One thing is to always wear your badge during the conference so that the guards can see that you're part of this group and not someone else who snuck in. We are only allowed to be in this part of the building. And it won't be easy for you to sneak out of this part of the building without help. But please try to stay here and don't try to sneak out. If you have to leave the building, for instance, if you need to leave early to go to your hotel, if you need to go out to smoke, smoking is of course prohibited in the building. Talk to me or to Ellen or to someone who is here to help, and we'll deal with that. We'll help you to do that. If there is an emergency, evacuation is that way. So that's pretty simple. The way you came in, it's straight out on the street. So that shouldn't be too complicated. And as you have seen, and you probably know, this is run as a hybrid meeting. So this meeting is we have participants joining on Zoom, and we are also live streaming on the CPR YouTube channel. So we're also recording this for economic policy to be able to document the discussion. So if you have any questions about the recording, you can read the privacy policy on the CPR website or contact the CPR data protection officer. So those questions will be fixed. And finally, because we are also online, remember that when you're speaking, please turn on your microphones here. So that everybody in the room and everybody online can hear you. So with that, I will leave the word to Pierre.
Thank you very much, Rolf. So thank you very much. So it's time to start now, this new panel. Before starting, I'd like to host a new incoming panelist. We have a series of people coming in. Thanks those who come out at the end. Axel Ferrier. So Axel Ferrier from Paris School of Economics is incoming. Emilia Garcia too. Federico Rossi also is coming. And Jan Stoller. So Miguel Almunia. Olivier Marie, and Tommaso Frattini. Okay, so welcome. Thanks for being here. And the discussion are very important here because at the end we discuss. So if you want to intervene, please move your name like that. And when you intervene, please tell your name at the start of the discussion so that we can record the discussion after. So it's so today is kind of special panel since we have a special issue on geoeconomics with a guest editor, Matthias. So Matthias, do you want to say a few words about this special issue?
Yeah, with pleasure. So I would like to thank the managing editors and the editors to have invited me to be a special editor, an invited editor on this special issue. It was a great honor and also a very exciting intellectual adventure. With a bit of challenge in the sense that we created this label of geoeconomics without knowing much on what would be exactly the content. And so, and thanks to you, dear authors, we managed to fill and to give some content to this name geoeconomics. We ended up with a very, very nice lineup of papers and authors. So you're part of the adventure, and we would like to thank you for that, for being here today. Very quickly, what you should know is that you will present the papers, you will get some comments, and after the conference, we will, the team of editors will contact you again to give you what is the final decision, accept, minor revise and resubmit, or quite unlikely reject. And potentially, we will ask you maybe to revise your paper along the lines of the comments that have been made during the conference. Okay. So that's it. And thanks for having responded with so much efficiency to the pressure we put on your shoulders in December and January and February for revising so fast your papers. I think this matter of urgency, you know, is due to the editorial constraint, but also reflects the fact that we are in urgent need of having compelling academic analysis. Efficiency to the pressure we put on your shoulders in December and January and February for revising so fast your papers. I think this matter of urgency, intellectual adventure.
Let me just also in the name of the managing editors, most of them are online, but thank you, Matthias, for your work, for taking on this role, and for your really like the intellectually extremely fruitful cooperation so far, and collaboration. We'll look forward to more. So thanks for doing this. We're blessed to have you. Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So now it starts, it's time to start, sorry. So you have 25 minutes, 15 minutes for the discussion. So please, okay, let's start.
Okay, thank you very, very much for this opportunity. I would like to thank the editors and all the organizing team. My name is Michele Di Maio. I'm from Sapienza University of Rome, and today I'm presenting the paper titled Trade Liberalization, Economic Activity and Political Violence in Global South, Evidence from Preferential Trade Agreements. This is a joint work with Francesca Modio, Leonardo Baccini, and Giorgio Chiavelli. So we know that trade liberalization creates winners and losers, and we also know from recent studies that in income countries, the distributional tensions which arise from trade liberalization have increased political polarization. We know that from evidence in the UK, in the US, and other countries. Less is known about these issues instead in low and middle income countries. In particular, we know that contrary to the prediction of standard trade models, globalization has not reduced inequality in these countries. And this is particularly important because it's possible that because of the weakness of political institutions, in this context, the uneven gains from trade and the consequent distributional conflict may trigger political violence. This is exactly what we want to try to understand a bit more. And so our paper in one slide is the following. So our research question is the impact of trade liberalization on economic activity and political violence in low and middle income countries. Our focus is on all the 25 low and middle income countries that signed a preferential trade agreement with an income country in the period 1995-2013. What we do empirically is that we propose a measure of localized trade liberalization exposure, which is plausibly exogenous, and which is obtained combining the reduction in agricultural tariffs over time with cell-level crop suitability information. Obviously, I will tell you a bit more on this later on. But essentially, we have this measure of trade liberalization, which is plausibly exogenous, and we try to use this to understand the impact of trade liberalization on economic activity and political violence. What we find is that both these outcomes increase, and in particular, they increase differentially more in areas which are more suitable to produce liberalized crops. The next step in analysis is trying to understand a bit more why the increase in economic activity following trade liberalization also increases political violence, and we propose two possible mechanisms, also helped by the referees in this journey. We look at the differences across crops. In particular, we document that there is, the effect is differentially larger for crops which are produced using less labor, so which are less labor intensive in the production side, and also that are consumed locally. Obviously, I will tell you more on this later, but this is what we are gonna see in the next 22 minutes. So, literature. We know that this literature, essentially our paper is related to the literature on the effects of international trade on conflict and political violence. This literature is extremely limited. To the best of our knowledge, these are the three papers that have tried to do this. Essentially, the key contribution here, we can say, is the one by Martin and co-authors, which essentially argues that the theoretical link between these two elements is ambiguous. Our paper is also related to a much larger literature, which looks at the effect of changes in economic conditions, in particular exogenous price changes and conflict and political violence. We have a number of studies using cross-country variation, but also a number of studies looking at the subnational level. And more recently, some of contribution have started looking more into detail of the type of crops that are affected by these price changes, showing different possible effects in terms of violence. How do we see our paper in this literature? Well, we see that as a contribution along different aspects. The first one is that we provide the micro-founded evidence that trade liberalization increases both economic activity and political violence. And we do so looking at a large sample of low and middle income countries, which gives us some external validity for our results. And we also document that there are mechanisms both on the producer and consumer side which explain this increase in violence even though economic activity has increased. And finally, in terms of policy, we argue that our analysis could be interesting because we are considering a policy tool in the hands of the governments on which the government have a control, which is a different situation with respect to those in which you have an external shock and then you have an impact on violence that we may have to confront. So it's a different setting that may provide interesting policy suggestions. So as I said, our sample is the 25 low and middle income countries, all of them that have signed a preferential trade agreement, which is essentially an agreement in which the country agree on reducing to zero the tariff on a number of crops or items in general. And we consider all the agreements signed with Australia, Canada, EU, Japan, South Korea, and US in the period 1995-2013. In the analysis, we combine a large set of data. The first one is obviously on the economic activity. To measure economic activity, we use night light luminosity, which is a common way of measuring economic activity when there is a lack of actual data on economic activity at the micro level. It is well known from the literature that this is a good proxy for economic activity in general, but in the paper we also show that it is a good proxy for agricultural economic activity in terms of validation of our outcome variable. As for political violence, we instead use data from the ISEF dataset, which is a source of geolocalized violent events, which include a large variety of events. And we use these to measure political violence, the number of conflict events that have occurred in the area that we consider. And this is important because we have different ways of measuring political violence, combining different way the events that we consider. As for the tariff, we use the DESTA dataset, which provides us with the crop specific, so for each crop we have the information of the de jure preferential tariff cut for each year of the implementation period. So we have information for each year of the period in which the PTA is implemented, which is the variation for the tariff for each crop. And we combine all this information to create this variable that I will tell you in a second. Finally, on the crops, we have additional information, which are essentially two. The first one is suitability, which is an information provided by the FAO Guides dataset. This is available for 42 crops at a very high detail level, 9 by 9 kilometer cell level, which essentially is a measure of potential output, which only depends on the characteristic of the soil of the area and of the weather condition in that area. So this is have been already used in other studies, but it's an important way of trying to understand the potential rather than the actual production of a given area. And we combine, as I anticipated you, this with information on the type of crop. In particular, we will split the sample of crop between high and low labor intensive crop and food versus cash crop. But okay, let me say to you after, and then finally we have other control variables that we describe in detail in the paper, but we don't have time here. Okay, so our empirical strategy is essentially the regression you see there, in which our outcome variable is either the night lights luminosity or the number of violent events for a unit I at time t. Then we have a fixed effect at the level of a unit I, which can be the cell or the county. I will show you the results for both. And we have here fixed effects. So the main explanatory variable is a variable that we call export exposure, which varies for the area I at time t, which is a combination essentially of two pieces. The first one is tau, which is the proportional change in tariff applied by the high-income country to the South country import of crop C between PTA senior year and time t. So it's the variation across time for the specific crop of the tariff included in the agreement. Okay, so it varies in time, okay, for the specific crop. And then we have suitability, which instead is time invariant because it's a characteristic of the area that we are considering to produce the specific crop C. And again, in the paper, we show that this suitability information correlates with actual production. So essentially, this gives us a measure of trade exposure, which is plausibly exogenous, exactly because we combine tariff changes with suitability, which is an exogenous characteristic of the area and the crop. Okay? So our main results. I begin showing you the results at the cell level. So when we use the most possibly segregated level of analysis, which is the one 9 by 9 kilometers, and our result, I will not show you any table because I don't have time, but I just summarize here the results. So we find that trade liberalization increases economic activity. And this, the size of the effect is not small, because we find that 1 standard deviation increase in export exposure, our explanatory variable, leads to 2 to 3% increase in night lights. And also when we do some computation, we find that night light would have been around 2% lower in the sample countries had the PTA not been signed. So the size of the effect is not small at all. And we find also at the same time that trade liberalization increases political violence, so increases the number of violent events that occur at the cell level. And again, I show you that the effect of not signing the PTA would have been having a 7% less number of violent events in the area. So the next step is to do the same analysis at the county level. Why so? Well, for a different reason. The first one is that, as one of the referees suggested us, it could be interesting to see the same result at a different level, in particular to a higher level of aggregation, because our cells are very, very small, and so it's also possible that we are violating the Swift condition. So the referee suggests us to use another way of aggregating our information, and so we went for the administrative units, which is probably natural ones to use economic and political effects as the one we are considering, and also one advantage of this is that boundaries of administrative units are not driven by data availability, which is sometimes the case when you use cell level information. So our results, again, are confirmed. We document that trade liberalization increases economic activity, even when we consider the analysis at the county level, and the trade liberalization also increases political violence. Okay, obviously the number of observation decreases, it's 200,000, but still the results are very robust to a number of specification, and so we are quite confident that this is correct. But obviously we also were asked to do additional robustness checks to our results, and so in particular we rerun all our analysis using the outcome variable in form of dummies, okay, we consider equality standard errors, and we also include the lag and leads in our regression to check whether our results are still there. And another robustness check that we did, which is very, very important, obviously, in our story, is about the changing, the way in which we construct the political violence variable. So as I told you, we count the number of conflict events that are violent, the violent events that occur in the area using the ISAF dataset. To corroborate our results, we also use an alternative dataset called the SCAD dataset, which includes other type of events from the one that we consider, and also a slightly different sample of countries between, so with respect to ours. Results are unchanged. So we find again that both economic activity and political violence increase in the area which are more suitable to liberalize crop. And finally, to increase our confidence in our result, we also use our same data set, but we combine the events in different ways. So we select a different subset of type of events to identify major political events which have different degrees of hostility with among them. Okay, so hostile, very hostile, and very high hostile. And results are still there. So before going to the mechanism, we also wanted to understand a bit more the characteristic of this link between political violence and trade liberalization. So we consider some of the usual determinants of the political violence which comes from the literature. And so we consider urbanization of the area, the remoteness of the area, presence of natural resources, oil and diamond in particular, and ethnic diversity. So we essentially want to understand whether the effect that we are documenting varies along this dimension. And what we can show is that the effect of trade liberalization on political violence is larger in urban areas, and also areas closest to the coast, which often are highly urbanized, while there is no significant difference for all the other determinants. Last step is try to understand a bit more why we have this impact. So, summarizing, trade liberalization increases political violence in areas more suitable to produce liberalized crops, so where the impact of trade liberalization is higher, and it does so differentially more in urbanized areas. Now, to understand why this happens, we, following the suggestion also of the referee, and we have to be very fair on this, we looked at the heterogeneity in the crop types. And in particular, we look at two types of possible heterogeneity. One is the labor intensity, and the other one is the distinction between food and cash crop. So let's start from the crop labor intensity. So here the basic idea is that political violence as a consequence of trade liberalization may depend on the importance of labor input in production. This comes from the famous paper by Dalbo and Lambo, by the other works that have looked at the differences in the importance of the inputs in production. And in fact, what we expect from this literature is that trade liberalization of less labor-intensive crop should increase political violence differentially more, okay? And to do this, to test this prediction, we essentially do a very simple thing. We take a categorization of low labor and high labor-intensive crops. It was not easy to find one, but finally we found one, and we use this to construct two measures of export exposure, one capturing this type of crops and the other one, and we use them simultaneously in the regression. What we find is that political violence increases only in areas suitable to produce low labor-intensive crops. So the effect is all concentrated in this type of areas. And which is our interpretation? Our interpretation is that the effect of political violence, the trade liberalization on political violence, is localized in areas in which the asymmetry in the gains from trade between workers, so the labor input, and land and capital owners is larger. We also do a check on the story about urbanization, and we find again that political violence increases only in more urbanized counties. And again, the idea is that the effect is localized in an area where the share of the population benefiting from agricultural trade liberalization is smaller. So essentially, we have this increase in political violence, and we associate that to the characteristic of the crop which are produced in the specific areas. At the same time, we also explore another possible story, which is suggested by a recent paper by McGurk and Burke, in which they essentially introduce distinction between food crops and cash crop. The idea is that the effect of violence may be different whether the crops are consumed locally or not. And the basic mechanism behind this is that you should expect that the effect of trade is larger in increasing political violence because trade-induced increase in price may reduce the real income in these areas. So there is a mechanism through the change in the price, and this may differentially affect whether the crop is consumed locally or elsewhere / exported. So we do the same as we did before. So we use this categorization that we take now from their paper, and we build our export exposure measure only including food crops, which are those that are only consumed locally, and cash crops, which are also those that are exported / consumed elsewhere. So running our regression again using these two measures of export exposure, we find that political violence increases in area producing mostly consumed locally crops, and it decreases elsewhere. So there is again a strong heterogeneity in the effect, and we interpret this as evidence of an opportunity cost mechanism at play. Why? Because the reduction in real income due to the price increase induced by trade is larger than the gains from trade. And so this difference between the type of consumption patterns explain why the conflict increases differentially more in area where there is only the so-called food crops. And interesting, we also find that this increase in violence is much larger in urbanized counties, exactly as we documented for the other channel and in our main analysis. So again, we find that the effect is larger on political violence in area where the share of population benefiting from agricultural trade is smaller. I'm about to finish. So what we have tried to document in this paper is that agricultural trade liberalization is both a boon and a curse. In which sense? In the sense that it brings about economic growth because it increases economic activity, but it also increases political violence at the same time. And we show that these effects are not small. So we find that nightlife luminosity and number of conflict events, which are our proxy for these outcomes, would have been 2% and 7% lower in this sample of countries had the PTA not been signed. So these are not small effects. And we also find, in terms of an explanation of this increase in violence, that probably what's going on is a struggle for the distribution of these gains from trade, among whom, on one side, on the land capital owners, and on the other side, agricultural workers and consumers of liberalized crop, suggesting that it's super important to understand well which type of crops and in which way these are affected by the policy that we are considering in the specific context, okay? So in terms of policy implication of our analysis, we have essentially two main messages probably. The first one is that our results will suggest that trade liberalization should need to be complemented with policy that can address what? The potential destabilizing imbalances of the distributional effect of trade that everybody knows. So everybody knows that trade has a distributional effects, and so once we go this way, we should also consider the way in which these effects should be mitigated. And our analysis suggests along which dimension these effects may be larger or smaller. And in fact, the policy implication in terms of what to do is that policy should target area in which agricultural production is less labor intensive, so is likely to benefit less from the trade increase, and the share of population, urban population is larger. So these are the two dimensions along which policy intervention should be targeted according to our results. I'm done. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this very effective presentation. So the discussion is. So yeah, you can. I see you can see it on the. So the discussion is Timo Fitzer, who should appear very soon.
Do you see my screen? Nope.
Okay.
That's not what I meant to be sharing.
Hi, Timo. So the floor is yours for. You can share your screen.
Yes, yes, I'm just trying to find it. Oh, God. Do you see my...
Yes, perfect.
It should say discussion.
So you can start your discussion.
Perfect. Yeah, thank you so much. I'm sorry I'm not there in person. I would love to be there because I think this session, this whole panel is really interesting in regards to also some past work that I've done in the context of the trade war between, that was initiated with the steel tariffs by the Trump administration. It was very interesting to see what one can learn about how countries essentially engage in trade wars. But this is also a very interesting paper and a very relevant paper because it speaks to the consequences of trade liberalization, trade integration. And of course, much of this literature has documented the diverse effects that growing trade integration can have, the sort of notion that globalization creates winners and losers. Now, this paper is one of the first that looks at sort of a violence channel or sort of a political sort of instability channel, in addition to documenting that there are economic gains from trade integration. But obviously, political instability and violence is an extreme form of a cost of trade integration, which might also help understand why some countries are engaging or not engaging in sort of essentially falling into these type of agreements. The paper looks at localized effects. Again, the big message why this is an important paper, an interesting paper, is that the support in favor of, broadly speaking, on average, wealth increasing trade integration, fostering specialization, is endogenous. So that support for trade integration is endogenous to the lived experience and the narratives that arise. This is why this work is particularly important. Would like to first sort of situate the paper a little bit in the wider literature. Most of this work has looked at trade-induced political shocks or kind of political instability, has focused on sort of the impact on Western Europe or North America, where some focus in recent years has been sort of on the political fallout. Let's say populism as being endogenous to the experience of accelerated structural change that might have been to some extent supported by sort of the China shock or growing sort of trade integration. Now, the existing literature in this case has mostly focused on documenting these associations, which has ignored broadly the timing of this, because obviously Trump happened a long time after the sort of China accession to the WTO and sort of the liberalization happened, in the same way that Brexit happened, with a significant lag, at least on some dimensions. And that obviously raises the question to what extent trade integration by creating grievances sort of is disconnected in terms of timing from, let's say, political events that we attribute to it, and also sort of ignorant a little bit to the underlying technology shock on which sort of grievances can feed into sort of these type of political shocks. What's really nice about this paper is that it's actually quite sharp on the timing, studying the impact of trade integration on violence in a quite sort of, to some extent, also an event study framework. But obviously, most papers in the existing literature go directly from grievances, which are sort of seeded in the mid or long sort of past, depending on how your discounting is, to sort of the political fallout without actually understanding what is the journey in between. And I think that's really important sort of gap in the literature. Now, in particular on this paper, what I think is really interesting is the discussion, obviously, on the mechanisms. I mean, the first order findings, I don't have any sort of, I think this is really quite well done. But I think the biggest discussion, and that was also raised, I think, in some of the referee comments on the mechanisms and sort of what's going on. The interpretation, I just repeat that here, is that there's a distinguishing of what are labor-intensive crops, what are not labor-intensive crops. And what the authors find is that political violence increases in counties that produce crops that are produced and as well as consumed locally, while it decreases in counties that produce crops that are mostly produced elsewhere, which suggests that there's an evidence that there's an asymmetry in the gains from trade between workers and land, and capital owners as the key mechanism. And I think, you know, this seems quite salient. I would like to add a few more points here. One of the heterogeneous effects tables is the one that I'm presenting here, which basically suggests that the impact of sort of, you know, export exposure in driving political violence is essentially coming from more urbanized counties or urbanized districts that are basically close to the sea or close to points of exports. And I think that's really important because it could also point to another mechanism, which is actually the ability to contest the rents that arise from growing trade integration, which are materialized through obviously the process of trade, which means the control of the points of exit and entry, in particular, in this case, exit, ports, and that infrastructure matters. And it happens to be that this tends to be more in urban agglomerations that are typically not on the interior of the country, but actually at the port, so close to the coast. And so, you know, assessing whether rents are contestable, politically contestable, I think is really important. Not just that there are rents, but also what is the mechanisms, the technology of how you can contest that. Of course, in a weakly institutionalized context, you can contest that by essentially exerting control over the points of export, right? Control over the physical infrastructure, or by just setting up roadblocks. Whereas an alternative interpretation is that in more strongly institutionalized countries, I would expect a lot of this contestation of the rents to occur via, let's call it the political system. And sort of obviously taxation and whatnot. And I think that really gets me to I'll elaborate a little bit more on this institutions channel that currently is missing, I think, in this discussion. In terms of just and again, there's a reaction potentially from the authors here, is how we should think of these effects. The paper is really silent on whether the effects are temporary or permanent. If we look at the event study evidence, that again, you know, is not using kind of the most recent version of doing two-way fixed effects with event studies, but broadly speaking, I mean, I have not seen any sort of paper that actually has been overturned as a result of that, unless it was really not carefully executed. So we should, just in terms of robustness checks and asking for more robustness checks, we should think a little bit about this as a profession. But if we look at this, what it suggests is that the effects on the economic side, the positive upside economic effects of trade integration seem to kind of grow or at least persist. The point estimates don't seem to go down, whereas the political violence effects seem to be more transitory. Again, that's looking at this event study evidence, which obviously raises a question to what extent, to what extent we should care. If it's primarily a temporary shock, it's all about how is that contest that happens in the political realm, how is that being sort of managed, right? And this is where the underlying institutions matter. If there's a shock to the equilibrium of power, that leads to some realignment. And in some countries, that is happening via the political system. In other countries, it might be happening via, let's say, boots on the ground in the most extreme sense. And so, of course, I think this is a really important question here. Of course, the lived experience of a temporary increase in political violence might be a barrier for countries to actually engage in that process, right? Because it challenges the existing distribution of power. And I think that's really important to understand what is missing in that paper, because you're only looking at a set of countries that have engaged in these preferential trade agreements. But the counterfactual is, the true control is there's a lot of countries who are not entering into these agreements. And the question is whether the experience or the potential risk of potential political violence is a barrier to that engagement. So in terms of, I have a few things about more additional exercise, what you could do, could not do. In particular, I'll speak about this a little bit, but I want to elaborate a little bit more on the role of institutions, because I think this is really, the mechanisms discussion has focused a lot on capital and labor. And I agree, that's a very important dimensions. The question is whether this is mostly these heterogeneous treatment effects are mostly identified, because these are interaction terms, whether these are mostly identified based on cross-country comparisons or within country comparisons. And this is not very clear. I would strongly suggest that, and usually I don't do this, but in this instance, I was tempted, I sort of point to a few measures of institutional quality or institution that the authors could consider, whether the effects are heterogeneous in, you know, the extent to which there are regular and elections that sort of, you know, govern the transfer of power, and whether these are well run. That speaks to the notion of what is the contest technology, of how the economic rents can be contested in a society. And I think this is an important feature here. So think about elections, whether there's an elected local governments, the degree of centralization or decentralization, because the paper fully lives of the fact that there's variation across parts of a country that are more or less exposed to this. Of course, if you have a sort of centralized or decentralized, if you have a revenue sharing system within a country, you know, that might change, might mechanically produce essentially spillovers that could help understand why in some countries a trade liberalization regime is followed by episode of violence or instability, whereas in others there's not, because there's more institutional stabilizers. Alternative institutional stabilizers are obviously the existence and the extent of the taxation system, which channels the rents into, you know, it creates multiple streams of rents, but it channels some of these rents to go into the political process, which, you know, might affect the estimated effect, so to say, the heterogeneity across countries. And of course, there's also the role of the welfare system that I think is relevant, the presence or the absence of a welfare system. So I was just checking on the chat, but that was not for me. So I think these are important dimensions that the authors could consider, rather than doing, you know, a simple sort of labor-intensive, capital-intensive distinction, where it's not clear whether the effects are identified by within, purely within, or to some extent also between country evidence. Why this matters? Sorry, is somebody trying to tell? Am I out of time?
Yes, yeah, 3 minutes.
3 minutes. Okay, perfect. That's just right. I think another potentially interesting dimension might be, who is the PTA with? The list of countries and PTAs that are being studied, I mean, they're heavily clustered on the US, EU, and ASEAN, which I think is a quite interesting part, because that is, you know, part of the geopolitical side, right? So you could actually look at this and sort of comment on this a little bit more, even looking at whether the effects are endogenous to who you go enter a PTA with, rather than on sort of looking at you know, just PTA as a generic term, because again, different country clubs or trade clubs, well, they have different systems of enforcement, and so the trade policy, you know, is not uniform across blocks. So I think that's quite interesting, to what extent, let's say, a PTA actually has meat on the bone. The other bit that I wanted to highlight is which countries are driving the effects. Both, if we look at here, this is the effect where it's then looking at just within country variations, so looking at each country in turn. What I seem to see, at least on the political violence effect, the effects seem to be most pronounced, driven by, in particular, Egypt seems to be like a big one. But then again, how this is rebalanced in the estimation, the cross-country pooling, pooled estimates, is not clear. And so what I would suggest the authors to do is to re-estimate the pooled regression, dropping each country in turn, to just see how sensitive the ATE, the average treatment, or the late, so to say, or the ITT, is to dropping each country in turn, rather than doing a country-by-country estimation, because I don't think that the effect sizes are standardized here in a way that allows me to compare that. You know, also in terms of particular political violence, we see that you know, Jordan, Egypt, and India are sort of important in terms of the effect sizes. But again, whether this drowns out the average in the pooled regression is a different question. I want to sort of one more comment, and then I shut up. Is in general, there's an arbitrariness of the consideration of space. And the authors have gone quite far into addressing this, looking at sort of grid cells and then sort of more conventional spatial units that are used for administrative boundaries. But I think in general, this conflict literature has often, I think the next generation conflict papers would actually have a more relaxed approach to space that actually takes into account the fact that there's arbitrary partitioning of the data, and the arbitrary partitioning of much of the sort of reduced form papers that look at conflict event data, which is georeferenced, as well as sort of some area specific measures, which oftentimes are satellite based data, basically means you can arbitrarily partition space. And I think that's a blessing and a curse. It's a blessing because it actually allows for very refined research designs, but it's a curse because it could also induce, it's the next level specification mining concerns that one might have, that, the inherent bias variance trade-off has a further dimension, which is essentially the underlying data granularity. And that's a choice feature for the researcher, unless one uses off-the-shelf data sets. But these off-the-shelf data sets, of course, they're implementing one specific grid size. Think about the Prio grid. And I think in general, there's some work that I'm doing in this domain that I think might be quite important going forward. There's a few more small comments that I leave for the authors, bilaterally to share. But it's a great paper. Thanks for giving me the opportunity to discuss it.
Thanks, Timo. Thanks very much. So it's time for discussion. Telling your name when you start speaking. So, yeah, you want to start, Philippe?
Okay, thanks, Pierre. So great paper. I have some questions on the policy implications, and Timo has alluded to some of the debate. So is one policy implication that, for example, for countries, Western countries who go into trade liberalization with developing countries, should that mean that, in fact, we should have long transitions? Does it matter whether the integration is a slow process or very abrupt, and to what extent it has an impact on this type of violence? The second question may be more important, and again, Timo alluded to this, is the institutional framework. To what extent the impact on violence is different in democracies versus non-democracies, because it speaks to the debate that, for example, we have in some other countries with NGOs, whether we should have trade agreements with non-democratic states. And final question is, in a sense, the implicit assumption is that political violence is bad in your paper, but to what extent in some countries, which are non-democratic states, some of this domestic violence is revolts, which are pro-democracy revolts, and to what extent all the violence that you're documenting and that may be caused by these trade agreements has negative welfare impact.
Thanks, Philippe. Emilia?
Thank you. This is Emilia Garcia Pendini. And first of all, great paper. I liked it very much. And I'm going to raise a little technical point because I'm coming from a different literature. And having read the paper, seen the presentation and the discussion, for me, it was not really clear about the exogeneity of the instrument. So I think it would be very nice to add to the paper. So I know it's borrowed from a different paper, your paper, but to look a little bit more on about how does the two components of this instrument, how do they correlate? So how does this specialization or suitability, the suitability, how does it correlate then with the probability of having a trade tariff reduction? And just this could be nice to see. I'm not sure if you have only trade reductions, but it could be nice to look at reversals in the tariffs to see how your results compare. That's it.
Thanks. Matthias? I thought it is, okay, Moritz, sorry.
Yeah, wonderful. Thanks so much, Moritz, managing editor. Very, very nice paper. I have two connected questions picking up where Philippe left it, which I thought were brilliant comments. The first is obviously there's this tension between trade raising sort of aggregate income and the distributional effects. And so there's one point, which is a very basic one, but I'm not sure I'm 100% convinced that I understand how it works in your paper, because the way you study these effects, you identify that in certain clusters you get additional income growth effect, GDP effects, and you also find that there are these effects on political violence. But you know, if people cluster more in these areas, there's more activity, there's all kinds of things going on. I would expect some kind of violence indicators also to increase. So the question is this above and beyond this increase in political violence, what you would just get in a world where, you know, you have more activity in a certain region triggered by the liberalization or by the trade policy change? And then another quick side point, maybe that was more in the presentation than now in the paper where it's a little bit clearer, but you focus very much on sort of the export liberalization. The question is like, what is the import dimension, and how should we think about that? Is this a separate channel potentially?
Thank you. Lionel Fontanier.
Thank you. So very interesting paper. So Maurice just said what I was prepared to raise as a question. So this is the import side of the story, because when we look at PTAs between developing economies and advanced economies, you know, most of the action is on the import side in the developing economy, meaning that you will have two channels that will play, or that may play a role on the political scene. One is the import competition. And so we know that the developing economy lower their tariff, but at the same time, they keep a certain number of products as sensitive products. They are allowed to do that. And so we could oppose sensitive products that have not been liberalized for, you know, endogenous reasons to, you know, products that have been liberalized. And this is where much of the action is. And often you can go up to 20% of the tariff line that are not liberalized in the developing economy, and this respects the kind of rule at the WTO. So you could oppose the two. And the second channel is that due to import liberalization, the prices of imports and consumption goods is also affected. And so it changes the overall you know, aggregate price of the basket of consumption for the different households differently, depending on whether you consume a lot of imported products or not at all. And so you have a differentiated impact on different households just because of the composition of their consumption basket and the fact that not all goods have been liberalized. So I think these are two complementary channels to the one that you have been raising on the import side. So, but this is the Moritz question, basically.
Thank you. Tomato?
Yeah, thanks. So I have like a question that was also, I think, echoed in a couple of comments before. So you're studying these 25 countries who did sign the agreement, but what about other countries? So why did these specific 25 countries sign the agreement and others did not? I'm wondering whether there is, so I don't know much, but are there instances in which some countries started negotiations that then failed? And would that be possible to somehow study what happens to trade agreements that did not happen? So like kind of what happens when you're let down during a negotiation, and see how that would compare. Also, I was thinking whether there is, I mean, some of the opposition to the liberalization could also materialize before the agreement is signed, right? So during the process of negotiating the agreement, there may be opposition, internal opposition. So what about violence that may happen before, during the process of trade liberalization? It could potentially also lead to a failure of trade liberalization. Then like a minor a minor question is about the effects that you are covering, that you are uncovering on economic activity. I'm wondering how do the magnitude of this effect compare to the magnitude of the effects that are usually found in other settings.
Okay, I have also a question about your results about the fact that you have more violence in urbanized area. To what extent is it due to the fact that just people move to protest to this type of areas? So, sorry, they are online. Isabel, please.
Yes, just very quickly, I just wanted to second on Timo's question about identification within or across countries. Sorry, I should have started by saying that I'm very sorry we are online. We've been facing flight cancellation, but I'm very sorry. So my question was about like identification within or across countries. And here, I mean, I agree that partitioning space is always somewhat arbitrary, but here there is a very natural level of geography, which is the country level, and that is very much related to the identification strategy. So trade liberalization is negotiated at the country level, and thus I think it would be at least the natural unit of analysis for heteroscedasticity or something like this.
Thank you, Isabel. Roberto?
Yeah, so let me join Isabel in apologizing not being there, but you know that's the effect of French strikes. So I would love to be there because many friends, many old friends among you. So including Michele, which has been a friend for more than 20 years now. So, but you know that said, so I think that a bit summarizing all the questions that have been asked until now, there is the big relevant policy question that is behind and which maybe you should better answer, is to what extent this political violence is desirable or not. I mean, is that the effect of the fact that, you know, there is growth and so people are asking more, and so that's very good news because it's going to end up in better institutions and some democratization sooner or later, or not. And so if you put it differently, you should be happy of that. And so put trade liberalization, even in places where institutions are bad, because they will improve, or you should condition trade liberalization on the improvement of the institutions. And I think that's, so all Timo's points were absolutely great because they help us to better understand this. And I would also add that also what Moritz was asking is my natural question as a crime economist: how much of what you're measuring is, you know, ordinary violence with respect to political violence, simply due to the fact to the agglomeration effect, which is one of them. Or the standard drivers of crime, actually. So I think that these two questions are really important. One, the second is purely measurement, but should be very clear what you're measuring, and it's instrumental to the first, which is more policy important.
Thank you, Roberto. There is one question by Monica.
Yeah, related also to some of the comments that have been made. So when you look at trade liberalization, you look at changes in tariffs, but non-tariff barriers may play an important role as well. And so I was wondering whether you could include them, because in the DESTA data set, you have also information on kind of the deep side of the agreement. So maybe you could include that.
Okay, thank you. I think we grab all comments. So now, Michele, you have 2 minutes to just I mean, obviously don't answer all questions, but just in two words, your reactions.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Timo. I really appreciate your great reading on the paper, and I have to say that your point about the type of context in which this political violence, of course, is important, and I mean, we have to try to see how much we can go that direction. I mean, all comments all the other comments are too also super interesting, and I mean, I don't know where to start from. Just one, maybe two details, but maybe can help in understanding what we are doing. I was not probably very clear on that. So our measurement of political violence are political motivated events. So it's not crime. The ISAF dataset records political motivated events. So what we're exactly capturing is that type of violence. So this somehow reduces a bit the concern about if it is people moving in the city, issue of mobility, which is also addressed by the fact that because our results are robust to the enlargement of the area that we consider, which is, I mean, the county level is much larger than the cell. So again, the concern about the fact that it's all driven by migration is a bit less probably worrisome in some sense. Last thing I want just to say, maybe I was very fast on that, on the issue of suitability and the measurement. So suitability is combined with the tariff reduction to create this variable which measure trade exposure. It's not suitability correlated with the liberalization. We use that to measure in the best exogenous possible way the fact that the tariff reduction increases the potential output for that area, which is our measure of export exposure. I hope this is a bit more clear now. On import, that is a great point. Actually, we have, not in the paper, but we did analysis in which we control for the same exact variable constructed use the import side, and results are there. So essentially, our interpretation is because we are focusing on agricultural products, which in this type of agreement are those that we expect to increase because it's South country which has easier access to the high-income countries. The possibility of the import channel is there, but is not what determines the net effect. So we have these results, and we're okay with the overall findings. And yes. Oh, sorry.
And you have the results with you, so as a control, as an additional control?
Yes. It was not in the version that we, because the focus was a bit less. I mean, it was an additional element, but we have that. And in any case, I understand it is an important point because obviously the bilateral relationship is part. I mean, there are also other very interesting questions, but I think I don't have time. So, but I took notes. Okay. Thank you so much.
Excellent.
Thank you.
So now it's time to go to listen to David, who is online speaking about private sanctions. So your screen is shared on my screen, but not.
Oh.
Here.
Okay.
I think this will be fixed. Okay, now we see it. So David,
now you see it. Okay.
Being almost here, and we are very happy to listen to you.
No, thank you very much for putting me on the program. That's a very exciting conference, and also I would like to thank the French air controllers actually for making sure that I'm not alone remotely today. I apologize for not being here. So the paper is called Private Sanctions. It's joint work with Oliver Hart and Luigi Zingales. And essentially, the question is this one. So since the invasion of Ukraine, there have been like various government sanctions against Russia, the seizing of yachts of Russian oligarchs, embargoes on oil and gas, the blocking of payment systems. So there's been like a various array of government sanctions that's been deployed against Russia. But in parallel to that, companies have been pressured to implement private sanctions too. So on the right-hand side of this slide, you can see two examples, McDonald's and BP, but there are many others. So these companies were under pressure of various stakeholders. So sometimes it would be like Twitter campaigns by activists of various sorts. Sometimes it would be just customers, and in many cases also shareholders demanded that some action is taken. As a result, very early on, more than 1,000 global firms have announced that they would exit or scale down their operations in Russia. Since then, there has been, reevaluated those pledges, and it looks like, many of them have not complied. But still, there was this pressure to act. And that movement is reminiscent of an earlier wave of boycotts that happened in South Africa in the 80s, some of which was actually done under pressure. I mean, some of those boycotts came from financial markets, from major shareholders of banks, in particular involved with South Africa under the apartheid. And those shareholders were very often actually religious institutions, interestingly enough, but not only. So why would it be interesting to focus on private versus public sanctions? There are two reasons mostly. Like, the first reason is obviously that it will create some kind of new form of business risk that is a business risk that was not so present before, in the sense that stakeholders have moral preferences, and those moral preferences, they want companies to actually, reflect them. And that may, that's tied to the whole debate on the deglobalization. But in general, the question that, is it the case that companies have to comply with their stakeholders' moral preferences? And beyond the pure question of private sanction, it's actually, the question of, like, should firms be moral person rather than just like profit maximizing? And as a result, does it pose a risk of fragmentation to capitalism, with companies being forced to apply a moral stance to reflect the preferences of their stakeholders, and therefore, be excluded from other sets of stakeholders? I'm going to have that discussion at the end. Okay, so what we do here, it's really an attempt to try to think about that question, really not really a huge answer. So our survey is essentially a question. We are asking people whether, as stakeholders of a fictitious company, they would approve corporate sanctions. And the questions we ask is the cost of this approval, is it important in determining their decision? So do they think about costs, personal costs to pay? Do they care about impact? So you may actually want a company to implement a sanction, but maybe the sanctions have no effect on the desired outcome. Is it something that you care about or not? Is there a difference across types of stakeholders when people pose as shareholders versus employees versus customers? Would they think differently? And also trying to study a little bit the cross-sectional heterogeneity of those answers and of those answers. Yes. And so the takeaways of our study is that the first key point is that people don't see economics and morals as separate. They consider that companies have to behave as moral entities. Second, there is not much difference between shareholders, employees, and customers. I'm going to qualify this a little bit if I have time. It turns out the propensity to pay for having a firm behave morally is the same, but it turns out that since companies have much more customers than employees, for instance, customers are much stronger base to actually force companies to comply with their moral tastes. Moral values explain the cross-section of attitudes, not so surprisingly. Costs matter a lot. So it turns out, like, if we ask people to think that their action is going to have a big cost, they are less likely to implement it. There is not that much. So no impact people are very likely to force companies to comply morally. So even if they have no impact on the company itself, and therefore no impact on the desired outcome, companies still have a very strong deontological motive. But of course, if we try to tune impact across participants, people who are told that they will have impact may sometime, respond more, but it doesn't happen very often. It may just be that our treatment is not strong enough, as you will see. Okay, so I'm first going to describe very quickly the survey design. There's a small framework just to fix ideas, but it's just one slide. And then, you know, I can move on to the result. I might have to skip robustness. We'll discuss that briefly. Okay, so the survey is very simple. So we essentially, what we do, I mean, the intuition is just, you know, to force people to think in hypotheticals with all the advantages and the drawbacks that it has. So we describe a hypothetical firm that decides to stay in Russia. That's in June of 2022. So a few months after the invasion. And so we describe that hypothetical firm. So it's a bit like the trolley problem thought experiment in ethics. And the advantage is that it's a very simple and crisp situation, which allows us to figure out what are the preferences of people rather than their beliefs about the world, rather than asking them, you know, should BP exit Russia or not, which implies a lot of beliefs about whether BP has an impact on the war, whether you know, BP has a big presence in Russia or not, etc., etc. Here, it's abstract, so it has drawbacks, but the advantage is that, you know, it's kind of, we strip it down from beliefs about the world. It's like an experiment. It's a mental experiment. And the question we ask our participants, our survey participants, is whether they are willing to exit the firm. Okay, so the firm decides to stay in Russia, and do you want to exit the firm or not is the question. Okay, so I'm going to be more precise about the question in a slide. And then there are 3 levels of randomization across participants. The first level of randomization is what kind of stakeholder you are. So sometimes we tell them, oh, you're the employee of the firm. Sometimes we tell them, oh, it's a firms you consume oil from. So there's a gas station you stop by and it belongs to this firm. Or you're one of the shareholders through your pension plan. You own shares in that firm. Then we also vary impact. So in some cases, we tell them, you know, if you quit the firm, you're going to be replaced the next day. Nothing is going to happen. If you're one of the customers, if you stop like taking oil from this gas station, you know, there's going to be another customer taking your place. And if you sell the shares, nothing will happen to the stock price. Or, you know, we can, you know, sometimes we tell them, oh, it has an impact. If you sell your shares, the stock price is going to drop by 2% because you're a rather large shareholder. And then the third level of randomization is the personal cost that is borne by actually exiting the firm. Okay, so quitting, stopping to buy gas from a gas station, or selling your shares, and that personal cost is scaled to be $0, $100, or $500 across participants. Some people pay more than others. Fictitiously, of course. And then we ask other questions. We ask people to explain their answer. We ask people about their moral values, taking like standard questionnaires, and you know, a few socio-demographics. Just to show you what it looks like, it's really a survey that's, you know, supposed to reach out to representative participants. There's a phone version and there's a computer version. And, you know, it's a very simple question. You are an employee of Acme, which is a large multinational with significant operations in Russia. You have an opportunity to quit your job and work for another company.
My situation, I am...
You can see my slides, right?
Yeah, we can go on.
Yeah. And so if you do this, it will take your current employer several months to find a replacement. So here you have impact. If you quit, it's going to hurt the company. The job, the pay, and your career prospects at the other company are the same. So it's kind of supposed to mean it's going to cost $0 to you to do that. And then, you know, they have to say how likely are you to resign using a Likert scale from 1 to 5. Okay, and it's, you know, the survey is designed to look nice also on the phone. Stakeholder, as I said, some impact. Personal cost is $0 here. Okay, so the survey takes about 10 minutes to do. So essentially, I mean, it's what most of the time is actually for the follow-up questions after that main question, which is like the first question almost. There's about 3,000 participants contacted through a polling firm. And it's designed to be representative of the US population by age and political affiliation. There are attention checks. For instance, in the middle of the survey, we have absurd questions, who we ask attentive people to answer both strongly agree and strongly disagree, 1 and 5, and people who fail that, and there are a few, are excluded. In the end, the very last question is an option to donate 50 cents out of their compensation in the survey to the Red Cross for Ukraine. So that's a significant share of the compensations, given that it's $3 per participant. So that means, that it's a significant effort, and, quite a few people donate, and it's going to serve in robustness checks. Okay. So before going to the hypothetical question, it's interesting to see how people think about whether they think that business and moral should be separate or not. The question is, as in the world of Adam Smith or as in the world of Milton Friedman, do we think that the first order of business is business, for instance, or should companies behave morally beyond, profit maximization? So there are a few questions designed to kind of try to figure out people's opinions about that. Sanctions should be imposed by the government. It is not the company's role to decide what is right or what is wrong. Only 30% agree with that. Such a decision to pull out of Russia for the company is a purely business decision. Management should weigh the economic costs and benefits. Only 37% agree. So essentially, what we understand from those questions is that participants do think that business and morality are intertwined. Put differently, at least, what the opinion they express is that companies should be willing to compromise on profit maximization to implement some kind of moral behavior, whatever they think it is, and whether it's possible to aggregate or not is a different question. So people are not Friedmanites, they're not Smithites, you can say. They think that there's a connection. Okay, so now, before I show you the results, let me show you how we think about that. It's a very simple, this is all the letters, the Roman and Greek letters you will see. So essentially, the decision of the participants to exit is a combination of 3 terms. The first term is the cost that you have to bear by, exiting the company. So remember, the company stays in Russia, it has decided to stay in Russia, and you're asked whether you want to exit the company or not, to quit, to sell your shares, or to stop consuming. And so doing so may have a cost, as we say, $100, $0, or $500. So that's minus CI. Okay, so you will pay for this in dollars. But then, there are benefits of exiting, and 2 of them. So the first one is what we call a deontological benefit, but you can call it, there are many ways to call it, but or warm glow in the altruism literature. It's RI. So irrespective of whether your decision is going to have impact or not, you want to exit. Okay, so either because you're following a rule that you think people should be following, or for other reasons, or simply because you're disgusted, or because you want to signal your virtue to the rest of the world or to the experimenter. And then the third term is an impact effect, which is essentially, lambda I is your pro-social preferences. And so my co-authors have been big on that. They have a few papers on this. So people care about consequences of their action, and lambda I measures the extent to which they care. And then, delta QI and delta WI are going to measure the impact. So let me show you the various elements. So I discussed the cost, the personal cost, okay? The second element is RI. It's what we call the deontological motive, whether you think of it as a moral imperative to exit a company that is accomplice, in a sense, that is an accomplice to the war or not, and also perhaps just virtue signaling. Okay, so we can't really separate those things. And then the third one is the consequentialist motive I was talking about. Lambda I is sensitivity to welfare, and then the 2 terms delta QI and delta WI, essentially one of them is going to be randomized. So is the effect of your exiting the company on the company's action, on the company's at least attention. If you sell your shares, the price is going to go down, so the company is going to notice. or if you stop consuming the company, you know, the output of the company revenue is going to drop, and it's going to be small, but if many of us do it, it's going to be material. And then delta WI is the increase in global welfare if the company exits Russia. Okay. And I mean, then people may have different perceptions of that, of course. Okay, so that's kind of the framework. Okay, so let's now, based on this framework, discuss the results. So at first glance, if we look at the data, I think the interesting thing here, you have the percentage of people that are in favor of punishing, so who answer 4 or 5 on the Likert scale. So on average, slightly more than a majority agree with this. The green bar is the difference between impact, participants who are told that they have impact on the company, and participants who are told they don't have no impact. Here, people who are told who have no impact are slightly less willing to answer, but the difference is not big, and I'm going to delve into that in a second. Cost matters a lot, and that's kind of good. It kind of shows that, you know, people, it's not completely free cheap talk, you know. When people are facing zero cost of doing so, they're very much willing to exit the company, 66%. While if people face a high cost, $500, then, you know, they're very strongly, you know, very much likely to, very much less likely to exit the company. Of course, there's a huge political divide. Conservatives are much less likely to punish than to punish the company or to exit the company than liberals. People who donate are actually, so people who end up donating at the end are actually much more likely to say that they're gonna punish that they're gonna exit the company compared to people who don't donate. Same for people who are concerned about the war. And as you can see in the end, the propensity to exit the company is very similar across categories of stakeholders. It's actually significantly smaller for shareholders compared to the other two. But, you know, otherwise, it's, you know, that's kind of, it's quite similar across stakeholders. So that's what I, okay. So then what we can do, and what is interesting, is that we can value the deontological motive. Okay, so how can we do that? We're going to focus first on the no impact people. So that's almost half of our participants, so 1,500 of them. And to these people, we tell them, whatever you do, the company is not even going to notice. So essentially, people are going to punish whenever their deontological motive, RI, is going to be bigger than the cost of doing so. So that suggests a way to actually find the value of RI in dollar. Okay, so essentially what we're going to do here is we're going to run that regression, the logit regression here, of the propensity to exit the company on the cost, just the cost. Here we're just going to put the cost first of doing so. And so a dollar estimate of the deontological motive is just going to be the ratio of the constant to the elasticity of exiting to the cost. Okay, so that's going to give us a dollar estimate of the deontological motive. And we do this here.
You have 4 minutes?
I have 4 minutes, okay. So here is the constant, okay, so the constant is 0.5. And here is it's a logit regression, and that's the sensitivity to cost. As we saw in the chart, it's very sensitive. You know, the t-stat is 7 in the entire sample. For customers, it's 5.2. So it's very strongly significant. And quantitatively, so we have found this in many other settings. And quantitatively, the estimate of the deontological motive here is just the ratio of 51 to 0.2 for the entire sample, and that's about $250. Put differently, people are willing to pay, on average, $250 to exit from this company. So you can imagine that multiplied by the number of customers, for instance, that's a huge amount. Multiplied by the number of employees, of course, it's going to be smaller. Okay, so then briefly to conclude, in the cross section, what we do is then that we regress the willingness to exit the company on various moral values. So they're here. So that's the cost here, which you just saw. But then we add other controls. So here are the moral values of people. So essentially, you see here that the value of compassion is very strongly positively correlated with the propensity to exit the company, which is not going to surprise many of you. What's slightly more surprising here is that the value of authority, so people who respect authority, tends also to be higher. So here we see a lot of Republicans that actually are anti-Russia, actually, and that's something we find in other regressions. They show up there. However, you've got the kind of the more classic modern Republicans who favor the loyalty to the in-group or the sanctity of several principles over everything else, and those people would be very much against exiting the company. Okay, liberals, even controlling for moral values, liberals are more likely to exit the company, and older people are more likely to exit the company. Okay, so let me conclude with this chart and then bring you to my conclusions. Here is the treatment on impact. So do you have impact or not? What you see here is that on aggregate, you find no effect of impact on the willingness to exit the company. However, shareholders are slightly more likely to respond to impact, and and they respond. So here, in fact, the treatment is monotonous. So you can have a 2% or a 5% decrease in the stock price, and that the propensity to exit the company is increasing with your impact. For customers and employees, we find no sensitivity to impact. Okay, so let me conclude. So what this survey seems to suggest is that there's a departure from the standard separation between business and morals. Business risk is therefore something that needs to be managed by companies. So let me give two examples. The first one is the risk of deglobalization. If, for instance, US companies have to sanction countries under the pressure of their shareholders or the customers, firms in these countries should start avoiding doing business with US companies. So it's gonna, unravel globalization. US companies may therefore decide, in order to manage this risk, to avoid doing business in these countries. So it's gonna also have an impact on multinationals, not just on exporting and importing, but also on deciding to have direct investment. The second thing is the risk, which is more which is not a trade-related question, is the polarization of business. If your customers, employees have strong moral values, companies may need to align themselves. For instance, conservative TV networks are going to show survivalist shows only, and progressive TV networks will show transgender characters, and audiences will segregate completely across these two networks. Alternatively, for some companies, it may be optimal to try to keep a broader customer base, to try to stay neutral, as companies used to do in the 50s and the 60s. That may become harder, but maybe that's possible, and maybe there are ways to do that. And that concludes the presentation. Thank you, Pierre, for your leniency.
Thank you very much, David. So now we are going to listen to Emilia, who is going to discuss the paper.
Yes. Very good. So thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this panel. And especially thank you very, very much for allowing me to discuss this very, very interesting paper. Let me start by just a brief recap of what David just said. So the question addressed in this paper is, why do private firms impose sanctions? And of course, the context is Russia's invasion of Ukraine, where these private sanctions were become salient. Apart from the government sanctions, we have now these private sanctions. And the way they address this question is through a survey in the US of hypothetical customers, employees, and shareholders, which they assign randomly. And they ask the set of stakeholders what are their views on continuing to do business with the firm that refuses to cut the ties to Russia. And so they analyze mainly two primary motivations. So a deontological motivation, the idea that I want to exit the firm no matter what the consequence is, and a consequentialist motivation, so which is whether the exit affects the company. And this is a treatment that was assigned randomly to the individual, so there can be causal statements coming out of this. And similarly, another treatment that was assigned randomly was a cost of exiting. So they estimate the sensitivity to the individual cost of exit. And again, this can be causally interpreted. So the main findings is that actually, like, Friedman's premise of the business is business sort of does not hold in the sample. So moral values matter, and they matter across all stakeholders. And importantly, there's this trade-off of morals with the individual cost of exit. So while the sensitivity to cost is similar across the stakeholders, this implies that actually, and this is discussed in the paper, that customers are the stakeholder group that has the potential to exert most damage if they boycott the company, especially if the margins of the firms are low. And the reason is that customers are the more numerous stakeholder group. So the cost to replace for a company with low margins, a customer that goes away is high. Now, there is a limited role for the consequences for a company, so they matter only for shareholders, and I'll come back to this point. And then they have a very nice analysis. I didn't mention but David did, that they have a lot of information about the participants in the survey, socioeconomic characteristics. So they they also answer many other questions that were not assigned randomly, but that give much more information and much more context and make this overall a very, very rich paper. So let me start with my overall comment. So this is an extremely interesting, very important, very policy relevant paper. I have to say that, so before myself, there were 4 different persons looking at this paper, so 3 referees and the editor, Moritz. So there was very little for me to say, except that this is really a very sound empirical analysis. It's a very complete paper. There is a random assignment of treatment, so across some treatments. So there's some possibility of doing some causal interpretation. There is an econometric model that is motivated through an economic model. So that's really, 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 really great. And so at the very end of his presentation, David mentioned all of the policy, some of the policy implications. This is something that I really liked about the paper. The final section discussing the implications for this new business risk. Okay, it's sort of a political positioning risk, and the implications for globalization and segmentation of markets. So globalization is across countries and segmentation even within countries. Okay, but it also contributes to the academic literature. Okay, so in the paper, they mention at least 2 or 3 literature on boycotting, the literature on moral preferences, which is a growing literature that has a lot of relevance also given other issues going on like the climate crisis and so on, ESG investing. And I would like to mention another literature which I think that this paper contributes to, which is the idea of this political role of firms, in this case of stakeholders. And this, so Luigi Zingales has some research on this. So most of this literature is about the economic power of the firms, the growing the growing role of political role through economic power, and this one is through values. Okay, so this paper speaks to the role of firms in democracies and vice versa. Okay, and of course, I think it's an important paper because it provides some guidance to understand why those firms that have not left Russia are still there. So is it because they have less deontological shareholders, or the costs outweigh the moral motivations of exit? Or maybe it's because, and there's a big discussion of this in the paper, maybe the institutional features of the firms and how preferences of these shareholders aggregate make it that some particular group of stakeholders has more weight in this. Now, let me go to my main comments. I have 2 or 3 main comments on this paper, and they are mostly about some nuances of the interpretation of some of the results, because as I said, this paper has been, so it's really a very nice paper. So my first comment is about the relationship between deontology, cost, and impact. Okay, now, by definition, deontological, and I'm taking from a footnote in the paper, so is the main utility benefit of taking an action is to follow the rule irrespective of consequences. This is just the definition of deontology. So whatever consequences, I will make a decision. Now, for me, I mean, exiting costs are also a consequence of taking the action, because they are only incurred if you decide to take the exit option, okay? Now, this idea is very much acknowledged in the paper, in the model, so in the econometric model, which is the one that I'm putting here in the slides, but also in the economic model, which is nothing but a rescaled version of this econometric model, okay? In fact, the deontological value, as David explained, is just estimated for when the parameters beta and gamma are equal to 0. Okay, that would be when individuals don't react either to this delta Q, which I'll go to this point in a moment, which is the impact, or the cost. So far, so good. What struck me a little bit contradictory is that some parts of the empirical analysis sort of ignore the costs as also as a consequence of exiting, okay? So I'm just borrowing from quotes. So in the introduction, there was a phrase saying deontological agents could be sensitive to the personal cost of acting morally. And then especially the first part of the analysis takes this idea even further and uses a sample where the individuals were told that exiting would have no impact to estimate the economic value of this deontological motivation, okay? And the argumentation is that in this sample, the motivation is purely deontological, okay? And actually the headline values that are estimated, so this value of $250 of the deontological value is taken from this subsample of individuals. Now, in my view, an implicit assumption of this, because it's just the value of the constant rescaled by something, an implicit assumption behind using this value is that the average deontological value is going to be the same for individuals who were told exiting has no impact than for individuals that told that exiting does have an impact, okay? And then if we go further in the paper and we look at the estimation of the complete model that includes the cost and the impact, we see that this assumption turns out to be true only for the subsample of customers and employees, but not for shareholders. So my suggestion would be to use Table 8 as a baseline for the estimation of this deontological value of the individuals. And if I did the calculations correctly, this gives slightly different results. So on average, actually, the number is not that different to what David showed us, the 264, but in that subsample, it's substantially higher for clients and for employees. But given that the constant is statistically zero, then it's statistically zero for the shareholders, who instead are consequentialists. So they are the only individuals that act according to the consequences. So it would be interesting to see all of the analysis done on this baseline. Okay. Alternatively, of course, let's just not label as deontology, but maybe, as one of the referees suggested, a better label could be something like the perceived moral obligation to exit. This brings me to a second point, which is the relationship between the model, how they model the impact, and consequentialist empirically. So in the model, delta Q is the increase in probability that the firm exits, given that the stakeholder exits, so that this has a repercussion on the war itself. And sorry, that the firm exits given that the stakeholder exits, the estimation yields a gamma equal to 0. But this does not necessarily mean that individuals are not consequentialist. And this is something that is extensively discussed in the paper, okay? And the reason why this is, the reason is that there is not a one-to-one relationship between delta Q as in the model and what is measured empirically, which is the disruption for the firm caused by I in terms of lower share price, replacing the employee, or the loss of the customer. And now, if for a moment we look at the results of the table 10, this is a table where, apart from delta Q, the authors also included what is the impact on the war. So whether exiting a company would have an impact on the war, okay? And if you look at the uninteracted coefficient in that regression, it's very, very significant. And of course, with all of the caveats that that particular question was not randomly assigned, it does suggest that there is some consequentialism of individuals, okay? They're just not reacting to the consequences to the company, but they're reacting to other types of consequences. And let me just say, this leads me to my next point, which is possible extensions for future research that could be taken into account is to consider different consequentialist motivations. Of course, war, so the impact of individuals' actions on the war is one possibility, but other alternative motivations could be things like loss of reputation, or the threat of incurring in the future in sanctions, okay, that the government will impose in the future in the sanctions. This is something in the spirit of what Tarun Ramadurai and Federica Zeni do in a paper that relates more to climate and things like that. So one could even horse race those motivations. And yeah, and of course, other potential extensions for future work could be then to consider other stakeholders. One thing would be suppliers. Of course, if a supplier as a stakeholder is a difficult thing to model because it's a firm and so on, but okay, I need to conclude. So it's a very interesting, very timely, very policy relevant paper, which I really enjoyed, and it gives lots of food for thought. And my main comment would be to adjust the interpretation of deontology to reflect the strict definition and maybe some nuances of what implications it would have. But this is a very important paper that provides several insights that I think will certainly open the door for follow-up research. Thank you.
So it's time for questions. Arno, you want to start?
Oops.
Oh, sorry. So I'm Arnaud Mel from the ECB. I also enjoy very much the presentation, David, of your paper and the discussion. And I had a question regarding the policy implications of the paper. You reminded us that there were precedents to private sanctions. I think you mentioned those that were adopted against South Africa in the 80s and the 90s. And this made me think that there were even earlier historical precedents to private sanctions, and that there's nothing new under the sun. I think the first example that comes to mind were the sanctions adopted in 1933 in the US or by US firms against the Nazi government in Germany. I think it's lasted maybe 6 years until the Second World War. Now, I mentioned that not for to make a nerdy point to be complete from a historical point of view, but there was a very important debate at that time in US Congress as to whether those private sanctions were more important than any public sanction taken by the US government. And you had exactly the same debate when the packages of sanctions against Russia were designed. And the question by policymakers was, are the private sanctions a complement or substitute or a catalyzer or something less effective than any sanctions that government could take against Russia? So I wonder whether there is anything that can be taken from your paper and your results that can shed light on that very concrete policy question that policymakers try to think about when designing optimal sanctions.
Yes, Philippe.
Yeah, I have actually a bit the same question than Arnaud on the interaction between public and private sanctions and substitution or complement. In a sense, the question is to what extent also should public sanctions mimic the private ones, because they represent the preferences of the population. So should there be of the same nature? Because in some sense, we should run more of those surveys to inform the government on what it should do in terms of sanctions. That's one way to see it. And in this case, or should we, on the contrary, have public sanctions that are maybe more consequentialist, trying to see what is really effective in terms of changing the behavior of the country we are sanctioning. Last point, I was wondering, so you have a cost, the $250 cost per individual. So the way I understand it is that that's what, on average, an American citizen is willing to pay as a cost for the sanction. So I've calculated that for the American population, that's basically $82 billion. Now, I mean, in a sense, it's not completely absurd question, but I was wondering whether you could have a discussion to what extent, if you take these numbers seriously, what it means at the aggregate level of what is the macroeconomic impact that the American economy is willing to pay, and maybe something also. It would be super interesting to have the same survey for European countries, of course.
Okay, just to follow up, because the same type of remark as Arnaud and Philippe, to what extent these private sanctions are motivated by a lack of trust in public authorities? Because if trust of public authorities, there is no more motive for public sanctions. So So I wonder whether this is the ontology or this type of lack of trust, how it is related. So Moritz?
Thanks, David. This is such a great paper that each time I confronted with this, I have new ideas. So sorry for the revision process. But so 2 points. The first is, knowing that you guys at MIT and Chicago have essentially endless resources. So have you thought about complementing some of this with observational data? Like some of the mechanisms could be interesting to tease out. No, like private versus public companies. Does it matter how close you are to, it doesn't matter whether you produce oil or chewing gums. I don't know. There might just be a dimension where some of the implications of the survey in the model can actually be sharpened. I mean, for example, I know that the Kiev School of Economics has this big sanctions database and has tracked all the firms that have exited and those that have stayed in Russia. So it could actually be something that could be like a nice test. And the second is on the
on this Friedman business of business is business. I don't know, the little bit, and this goes into Philippe's direction. It's almost like I want to push this a little bit towards geoeconomics again. Are these big war and peace questions different? Would you think we get similar answers or similar insights when we're talking about, you know, where businesses take a stance on, I don't know, abortion, or like questions that are loaded in different ways? So my hunch is there would be, and this is what I think Philippe meant with like sort of the public interest and geopolitics and geoeconomics being sort of maybe aligned in some cases, but not in others. So I don't know, there's a little fuzzy, that second point, but maybe you can make sense of it.
Thank you, Maurice. Tommaso? Giacomo, sorry. Giacomo.
Almost the same. So thanks so much. It's actually very fascinating. In a way, it's disturbing to me, in a sense that, you know, it's bringing up a lot of the issues that are, I mean, actually raised very well, which is, you know, this is related to ESG, climate, all of that. And I think it's a framework that is completely new in a way. I mean, Jean-Charles and you guys have worked on this, but I have a couple of points that some of them are somewhat technical, so I don't want to go too much into that. So one thing that I kept on thinking is, you typically think about this as a random utility model, right? So it's a McFadden model where you basically have, you know, whatever, cost and benefits. The issue here is that you should then provide a joint distribution of the so you should provide a full matrix, not just an independent matrix where you actually have one of the marginal and then the marginal. Because if I know what the cost is, but I don't know what the benefit is, then my answer is not the right one. I mean, it's, you know, so they have to take a stand. What is the benefit when you give a random cost? What is the cost when you give a random benefit? And if you don't provide the joint distribution of that, that's a very hard object, I think. That's, you know, just expectation. Anyway, so I think that's a more technical point. In that sense also, it's related to, so the logistic regressions you run will have to take a stand on what the epsilon is. And given the survey design, it's not clear to me what the epsilon is. Really, it would be interesting to know what you have in mind when you think that epsilon is there. What is that? Is it just a preference shock? What is it? Because there's no uncertainty around the outcomes you're telling people. You're fixing them. You're not even telling them what the impact is, because you're telling them what the cost is, and then some other people are telling what the impact could be. So I think, you know, one needs to take a stand there, and it'd be important to do it that way, even just in the survey design. And this can be done. You need a different survey. And I'm going to stop there. But thanks so much. This is actually really fascinating stuff.
Charles?
Yeah, let me say, like everybody else, it's a fascinating paper. I was wondering, what is the importance of governments ordering the sanctions? Apparently in your questions, it's not, people are not told whether the sanctions are mandated by the government or to be taken freely by the corporation. If I'm right, most sanctions are mandates by governments. So going against the sanction is really going against the morality, according to your result, of the stakeholders and again the authority. Do these things matter? Do you have an idea of how important these considerations are?
Okay, so I think there is no more questions. So David, you are lucky, you have 4 minutes to answer.
That's really good because it will allow me to pick the questions I want to answer. Thank you very much. No, thanks a lot for these are all extremely thoughtful comments. Some of them we have answers for, some of them we may be able to address, and others that are actually very excellent suggestions for further research. I think this is something we want to continue to work on. So I'm glad we were able to pick your brains on this. So thank you first very much to Emilia for your discussion. It's a very thoughtful one. I agree with you that we need to improve on the design. So for instance, if I was to rerun the survey, I would be much more precise about the consequence of the individual on the company on the war. You know, we would need to read. Essentially means like. changing the questions, but we could be much more analytical on this. And it turns out actually we were not initially. So that's something we should improve on. And there will be a lot to learn about actual consequentialism of people. What's actually delicate here, what's difficult, the challenge, is to make sure that people really realize the consequence. So there's always, if you find that people do not respond to consequences, it may just be that you didn't manage to reach out to them. You didn't manage to get their attention, that they don't really realize, etc. And that's always a danger with these surveys. But there, we can definitely do better, I agree. Excellent point on the fact that shareholders are, in a sense, 100% consequentialist. It's a good catch, actually. It's in a sense true, even though the constant is very noisy, so it's not 100% clear. But you know, it's a good point. And then on the distinction between deontological and consequentialist, I think that's a virtue of the model, that it distinguishes two forms of consequentialism: the consequentialism to yourself. Okay, so for instance, not showing up. So one of us is actually, so there's a farm stand in our suburbs, and one of us is actually, so the other Cambridge resident is actually doesn't want to go to this farm stand because it's, you know, the boss is a Trump supporter, and he knows that he has no impact on the revenues of that farm stand. There is no, I mean, he has no impact at all. And it's actually costly to him to not go because it's a very good farm stand. It has a lot of good products. So it has a consequence in terms of your own welfare, even though it has no consequence on the actual welfare of the guy you're trying to exit from. So in a sense, there is a clear distinction between these two forms of consequentialism, in a sense, that I think is something that the model clarifies, and that is actually present in the altruism literature, in a sense. But you know, that's when people donate, they get a warm glow from donating, you know, but you know, they pay. So that's so I mean. Okay, and then I don't have that much time, so there are a lot of good things. Arnaud, I would love you if you can send me some Nazi references. That would be great.
Pleasure.
Philippe, thank you very much. It's a great question. So, but it would require asking a lot of asking different questions. It ties in a little bit to the Moritz point that, you know, what kind of company are we talking about? I think it's true that it depends on what is the actual impact of the company, in a sense. So some companies may have some impact and some companies may not. Like, for instance, let's say the big pharma Sanofi. I mean, there are lots of French expats in Boston that work for Sanofi. And so, I mean, they still operate in Russia, for instance, because they believe that, you know, they would do more harm by, you know, pulling out rather than staying. So it depends on the company, and then having a cross section of companies would be great. We try to do that a little bit by having by asking people who they work for, but of course they were not obliged to answer. And you know, that since it's not I mean, it's not a mandatory question, we don't really have good answers to that. But you know, asking people, but maybe you could vary, you know, the industry, etc. But I would involve running another survey. And there's another point, and then I'm gonna conclude. By Philippe about the size of the willingness to pay. We actually, in the paper, I was trying to find the exact numbers, but we're trying to compare to actual, you know, the willingness to pay of governments, even though it's different, but, you know, willingness to pay of governments to fight a war, or the aggregate donation. So, you know, willingness to pay of German people to reduce their gas consumption, you know, during the discussions about the embargo. So Armin Falk has a survey on this. So we can basically try to back out some kind of aggregate willingness to pay to basically show your disapproval of the war or do something about it. I mean, it's in the tens of billions, but, you know, it's always hard to compare. I think I'm over time already, Pierre. No, I'm in time.
Just on time. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for all your comments, and sorry to the ones that I haven't answered to.
Okay, thank you. So on our side, there is a break now
for
building bridges to peace with an activity. So we have a half an hour break.
Thank you for inviting us. This is really exciting for me. I have a cold, so I'm slightly less enthusiastic than I am, or sound less enthusiastic than I am. So this is literally a policy project that became an academic paper. So I really feel I'm fitting really right in. So I hope you don't take me apart on this endeavor. But let me give you a little overview of the motivation. So power sharing is really motivated, or research on power sharing is really motivated by the fact that peace agreements are one of the default instruments for peacemaking in the context of civil wars. And external wars as well, but we study civil wars. And the focus here is on agreements that have a power sharing element, and these are the large majority, I would say 90% or even more. Oh, this is... Ah, okay. Okay, so I should stay here. The gods are telling me. The gods are telling me I should stand to this side of the room. So, and so we do a quantitative study of power sharing agreements and peacekeeping missions. Peacekeeping missions really is a sideshow. And so we are asking the effect on internal political violence and the bridge to broader changes. And the bridge to broader changes, I'm going to be very short on this. I don't think we have this kind of nailed, because it's very hard to nail that. But power sharing in the data, the data allows us to do quantitative evaluation now because we have this amazing UCDP data that everybody relies on, or ACLED, but we use UCDP. And we have this really nice data set that's called PACS that codes power sharing agreements on many, many dimensions. And this kind of human-coded effort where they go through all the agreements that were made and they go to all the different aspects that these agreements had. And then we add UN peacekeeping troop presence and budgets that we kind of scraped ourselves. And we also add our secret sauce, which is something we've been doing for quite some time now, which is forecasting conflict all around the world on a monthly level with using machine learning and some text. And our methodology uses these forecasts for causal identification strategy. So let me first tell you a little bit about the PACS data. There is many aspects one can think about and one can look into, and we actually tried very hard to find heterogeneous treatment effects, and the only thing that we found very strongly is a difference between comprehensive agreements and non-comprehensive agreements. So usually what you have is a process where like several non-comprehensive agreements where the parties of the conflict agree that they want to keep talking, and they start, for example, ceasefires. They start to do ceasefires. They agree on some things, some elements, and then at some stage they say, let's really sit down and make a big thing where we allocate resources and redesign the state and so on and so forth. And these are comprehensive agreements. And what I'm showing you here is kind of the PACS coding on, does it contain an element of XYZ? And you see that basically comprehensive agreements contain much more of everything, right? So they contain more things on the security sector, on governance, on human rights and equality, and socioeconomic, and so on and so forth. But I think that what I would like to point out is that they kind of this points kind of peak. There's a little peak here, relatively speaking, on the justice sector reform. I'm going to come back to that towards the end of the talk. Okay, so here's the problem. The problem is that these things select into high risk, and we were hired by the German government to do a quantitative analysis, and we started analyzing, and basically you get like positive correlations all the time, right? So it's just like you start regressing violence on power sharing agreements, and you get super high positive coefficients, right? So really bad news. But the reason is that these things obviously select into violent situations, right? They have a unit that is flying around the world to the hotspots of violence and trying to offer themselves to negotiate or offer like external support for negotiations that are going on in Colombia, in Afghanistan, and so on and so forth. And so what I'm showing you here is basically take our risk forecast and order all the observations of the world in the past according to this risk forecast, and then look at how likely is it that in a bin of this risk forecast that you have a power sharing agreement, right? And you see that there's a very, very strong selection into the kind of the high bad situations, basically. And so I'm looking at power sharing, all power sharing agreements, comprehensive agreements, and I'm looking at the intensity forecast and the occurrence forecast. Occurrence is like, do you have any conflict at all or not? And so here are some timelines. And I think this is, for us, when we saw that the first time we started looking at timelines, we were like, okay, yeah, so this it looks kind of, that there is something, right? Mozambique is like a very strong example, I think, where there's violence, then you have a comprehensive agreement, then the violence stops, it stops for a while, then there's another outbreak of violence, and they have a non-comprehensive agreement, then the violence stops for a while. Now Mozambique is completely escalating again. So these things are like selecting into violent situations, but seem to, visually at least, seem to stop violence for some time. And of course, not always, right? So here, Iraq, total failure, right? You don't see anything, basically. It's like they are trying, right? But there's no real visibly effect. So like the question is, statistically speaking, is there any effect on average or not? And so the identification problem is agreements are signed because there is a future risk of violence. So it's like the future risk of violence that is leading to the signature of a peace agreement. So like you're in a bit of a kerfuffle, identification-wise. And so our method is doing the following. Call the adoption date 0, then define treatment windows around this 0. So say 12 months before and after. Then draw random control windows of the same size around placebo zeros, right? Find other situations in the data set and call that a 0 and then draw windows around that. And of course, make sure that these are not overlapping with actual treatment windows. Like, so outside of the treated windows, find placebo windows. But now the secret sauce, match the control group by our forecast. So look at the average forecast in the 3 months before the signature of a peace agreement or power sharing agreement, and match the control group according to that forecast. Right? So we are trying to match situations where there was a high risk of violence, and then there was a peace agreement with other situations where there was a similar extent of risk and there was no agreement. And so that leads to, I think, leads to kind of like a fair comparison. And so then after that, once you have that data collected, that's the big effort. Once you have it that way, you can just use a standard, now standard DID method, and we use Calaway and Santana, and basically we just use everything they provide. They have a beautiful data code that we also just hijack. So our contribution here is really we use more cases, including more recent data. We study monthly violence dynamics around agreements and peacekeeping missions. So this monthly character, I think, is important. And then we use this methodology of matching on a forecast, and we rethink. This is new. I'm very interested in what the reaction of this room is towards me claiming that that's a novelty. If there's something that exists, I'm very happy to find out about that. So what are the findings? So this is like one of the many graphs we have in the paper. This is a 12 months window matched on intensity forecasts around here, these three. Right, and this is violence occurrence and violence intensity. And I hope you agree with me that it looks pretty good, it looks fairly flat, then has a little dip, but that's not significant at 0, right? And then after the month after the agreement, you see a significant drop, and that stays down. If anything, what we find is that kind of accelerates the trend downward at as time goes on. And so these are comprehensive agreements, these are all agreements, and these are comprehensive agreements. You see much more this difference between the 0 and then at 1 time 1, you start having like a really strong effect. And so in tables, so here on the top, you see all power sharing agreements, and you see increasing window size, and here you see comprehensive power sharing agreements, and all, again, increasing window size, and you see that the coefficients always point in the same direction, but here the standard errors are high, and the point estimates are very low, so we don't get really strong significant effects. And here for comprehensive agreements, we get strong effects. And note that, of course, I'm always matching it with the risk forecast. So if comprehensive agreements go to different situations, then we are controlling for that by also picking the control group differently. Now, there's one more thing, and that's more experimental. We were too I think it's one of these things where you're very, I'm not really sure whether I understand this following graph completely, what's going on, but I was too tempted to put it in. And I think it's a really interesting way to think about causal identification. Namely, what we can do is, our forecasts capture conflict dynamics using machine learning, and they use the full model. So that for the full model is our best model, which uses information contained in millions of news articles, and we use that in an optimal way. So we really try to get this right. And we forecast 12 months into the future, and we do a pseudo out of sample. So we pretend we only know the things we know until, say, November 2012, and then we estimate forward, and then we put ourselves in the shoes of December 2012, and we estimate forward, and so on and so forth. So our data that we have is pretending that we know nothing else than what we knew at that time. And that's important for the next picture I'm going to show you, namely, we can look at the forecast, and we can look at the errors of these forecasts to understand the treatment effect, namely, shift the definition of treatment so that 0 is when the agreement enters the forecast horizon, right? So you're like 12 months before the thing is ever agreed on, and it enters your forecast horizon. And now I'm wondering, given the information available at times 0 to 12, so before the agreement even is agreed on, and with the information set that people had at that time, is the forecast too optimistic or too pessimistic, given that it will come, but given that there will be an agreement at time 12? And so how does the error evolve over time as we are approaching the adoption date? And so this is how this looks. So the red bars are when the agreement is not yet in the forecast horizon, and then on the first blue bar, the agreement enters the forecast horizon, right? But of course, our forecast is more driven by the events that are close to it. It's easier to forecast something that's like 3 months ahead and 4 months ahead. So 12 months ahead is really like you might see it coming, but it's quite far away. And you see that's fairly flat for a while, but then it starts to dip like around 5 or 6 periods before the adoption. And here you even see like slight increase and then decrease. We can talk about that, what that means. I'm happy to do that. But what does that mean? What this means is that right at the adoption date, our forecast is too pessimistic. It thinks, oh, violence will be much, much higher than actually the realization that happens. So the way we define the error here is the actual forecast. Sorry, no, the forecast minus the actual violence. No, it's the other way around. No, the actual violence minus the forecast. Yeah. And so negative numbers mean we are pessimistic, and positive numbers mean we are overly optimistic. And so I do find this is really interesting because it kind of means that our model doesn't see it coming. If we had somebody who could tell us, oh, there will be an agreement in 3 months, we would do better in the forecast by adjusting our expectations about violence in the future, in a sense that there will be less violence, right? And I do think that's interesting because it means that because we are using news and everything, using the entire news landscape, I don't think it's very, very likely that people saw it coming, right? So we have all these very sophisticated papers now that are saying like, oh, people are very super forward-looking and optimizing really sophisticatedly into the future. And it appears that our system at least is not able to anticipate the impact of the power sharing agreement. So it's too pessimistic, and it becomes increasingly pessimistic compared to the reality right before the adoption. And so for comprehensive agreements, this is also true. There are very similar shapes here. Okay, so summary of the findings. We get strong effects with longer time windows. We get comprehensive agreements have like 7 to 14 percentage points reduction in occurrence and 34 to 59% reduction in intensity. These are very large effects, I think, very large effects. Results are only weakly statistically significant for all agreements, but stronger effects towards the end of the window. And then looking at this forecast experimental thing, the forecast is becoming too pessimistic as the treatment approaches, and power sharing agreements are positive surprises to our forecasting system. Now, we do a lot of robustness. Mostly we do this because of the matching, right? So the matching could have a big impact, and we test that. We do, like, for example, completely random matching. And what you see with completely random matching is that the effect goes slightly down, which makes sense, because if you're selecting into negative situations and you control for that, then you should see a bigger effect. We do things with the window because, you know, we're worried about like overlapping windows, and so that we fix that. We try to say like, okay, what if we ignore that and we allow for overlapping windows, and so that doesn't make a big difference either. And then very importantly, there's many other policies that are taking place at the same time, right? So this is, I think, the biggest remaining challenge, and we try to approach that by saying, let's look at the big thing that is definitely on people's minds, at least the diplomats we're talking about, namely peacekeeping, right? So what you see in the data is you see a power sharing agreement is agreed on, and then on average, the peacekeepers pile in, right? And so that's a danger to our identification, because maybe what we are picking up is not the peace agreement, but it's just like the peacekeepers. And so we are running peacekeeping controls and we see zero effect. And actually, when we do the opposite, we kind of look at peacekeeping controlling for the power sharing, we also see zero effect on the peacekeeping. So we think it's the other way around, that people find very strong effects of peacekeeping, but they ignore the political process that allows for the peacekeepers to come in. So all that said, this kind of short run stuff, right? And I'm I'm kind of obsessed. My own work is really, or our own work is really obsessed about the conflict trap and how countries can escape the conflict trap. And what you saw is not very encouraging, right? Mozambique, and they all come back. And so, does it help in the long run? And so what we did was really like, it was a very pleasant experience, because we had a policymaker who wanted to just find out stuff, and we did a massive data mining exercise. We're just like running regressions of everything on everything, and it's basically just looking at patterns in the data. And what I'm showing you here is just like the correlation controlling for country fixed effects and month fixed effects of violence and different aspects of democracy, okay? And so what you see is that there's, of course, this is not a causal identified. I'm not claiming that at all. But what you see is that it seems to be true that kind of movements in the egalitarian index of the VDEM, VDEM has like these 5 indices, is most strongly correlated with reductions in violence. And that's true for intensity and for occurrence. And you see that deliberative democracy is kind of a little weaker, but you know, they're all there. For intensity, you see it a bit stronger, that basically you don't see any effect on the deliberative component, and then the participant component is kind of there. Electoral component is a bit stronger, it starts to be significant at 10%, and then you have a egalitarian component being a bit stronger again. Now, what we do is we then drill down and we go, so I don't know whether you know the VDEM dataset. The VDEM dataset is like this monster of like having many different institutions that are measuring, and they're repackaging them and calling them different things, right? So egalitarian democracy is a mix of these 5 or 6 indices. And then, you know, the other thing is like exclusion is like a mix of these 3. And so what we find is that in the exclusion mixing that they do of their indices, we get super strong, very statistically significant associations. So violence reductions are strongly associated with less exclusion by socioeconomic group, less exclusion by gender, less exclusion by urban-rural location, and by impartial public administration and access to justice being really like a super strong, statistically significant association with a very, very large point estimate. So what we think might be going on, this is totally speculation, is that it seems to be true that there is a change in the relationship in which the state interacts with its population, right? So there's like people are less excluded and they have more access to public services and they have more access to justice. And this is highly correlated with reductions in violence. Now, what we then did was we use our, yes, okay, thanks. We use our methodology of the difference in difference to then look at these aspects of VDEM, because it's also monthly data. We can then look at, do some of these aspects change in the way we want with the adoption of a power sharing agreement. And what I'm showing you here is the comprehensive, the start of a comprehensive agreement at 0 again. And you see that exclusion drops across the board. These are 18 months now. And that's quite a difference compared to the all agreements. There's less there's some effects sometimes, but not across the board. And so we also find this is true for access to justice and things that seem to be very strongly associated with reductions in violence. And so we are thinking, of course, this is not strong evidence, but we're thinking that maybe it is true that if you start putting the justice sector reform into the peace agreement already, then you're kind of planting a seed that can then lead into a better provision of these public services down the road. And maybe that's what makes the peace stick. It's not only like the elite bargain, and let me get to my last point. It's not only the elite bargain and the power sharing horizontally, but it's also like something that changes the vertical relationship of the government towards its own people. So you all know the Patrick François paper, I assume. This is showing that, you know, power is shared in African countries. People, ethnic groups that are in power tend to have ministers that are of different ethnic groups. And so ministries are shared quite nicely in the sense of like shared to their proportion of population. So seems to be a real balancing act always going on where like, okay, we give this ministry to that ethnicity. And so we try to really share power according to our informal power. And that's very much in line with this Chang et al. Paper, which was super influential in the policy circles. So you might not know it. I didn't know this paper, but it's like when you talk to the British Foreign Office or the German Foreign Office, they always say like, power sharing, have you read this paper? So this is about elite bargain as one way of looking at how power sharing happens and why it helps. And so what they are saying is large-scale violence will only stabilize when the distribution of benefits in a society supported by its institutions is consistent with the distribution of power in society, and the economic political outcomes of these institutions are sustainable over time. And so that's this big framework that they propose. And you know, you can kind of fix peace by helping the elites finding that nice bargaining solution. And so what our results suggest is that the most stable and peaceful bargains results seem to be those that manage to combine this solution to the horizontal problem, where you have different ethnic groups represented by their elite, being happy, but also you combine that with kind of institutional changes that address the vertical dimension, namely access to justice, you don't exclude, yeah, okay. And so, yeah, there's other mechanisms that are out there, but I'm done, basically. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you very much. So the discussion is Tommaso.
Okay. All right, so okay. Okay, so thanks a lot for the nice presentation, and thank you for inviting me to discuss this paper. So the paper, I mean, I think the presentation was pretty clear, but just to summarize, the paper studies empirically the effect of power sharing agreements in reducing political violence, so the effectiveness of power sharing agreements in reducing political violence in conflict situations, focuses both on the intensity, on the occurrence, and on the intensity of violence, so on the sensitive and intensive margin of political violence. The paper is based on a rich variety of data sets, so that there's been a very large data effort, so like not all the data have been collected by the authors, but they put together several data sets on different aspects of conflicts, peace agreements, characteristics of democracy, and also on these conflict forecasting tools that the authors have themselves developed. So they're putting together all of these data sources, they end up with a large data that spans over 440 power sharing agreements, 73 of which are comprehensive, and this is an important distinction, as was pointed out earlier, and then as I will also come back to later. Combined with the monthly data on violence and on characteristics of democracy for over 170 countries for a period spanning more than 30 years between 1989 and 2020. So a very large data set, and then the authors use this data to perform state-of-the-art match defensive strategy. So they do all the new, all what is required by the new development literature on the defensive, augmented with a very interesting matching strategy based on their conflict forecasting tool. The results, I'm reporting here again the graph that you've seen before. The results show clearly that violence falls after power sharing agreements, both in terms of intensity and in terms of violence outbreaks. Additionally, comprehensive agreements are shown to be more effective in reducing violence relative to partial agreements or non-comprehensive agreements. So agreements that only, so the difference between comprehensive and non-comprehensive agreements is that comprehensive power sharing agreements entail power sharing in a larger domain, in a larger number of domains relative to other agreements that are only restricted to some specific subjects or some specific domains. And this is an important distinction throughout the paper. And another result is that power sharing agreements are followed by institutional changes associated with reduction in violence, such as the absence of exclusion. So these institutional changes are the absence of exclusion across political, social, socioeconomic, gender, or geographic dimensions. So this seems to be, I mean, my way of reading the paper is that this seems to be the way through which power sharing agreements operate in reducing violence. So overall, I think this is a fascinating work. The topic is certainly very, very relevant. There's a huge data effort in putting together all of this data set. And I also particularly like the way the authors use the conflict forecasting tool that they've developed for causal inference. So that's a nice application of their own conflict forecasting tool. So my remarks are, I have grouped them in three areas. One has to do with research question, one with identification, and the last one with the structure or exposition of the paper. So the paper addresses many issues, and perhaps in the presentation, the exposition has been also, it has come out, this has come out more clearly, but the emphasis is especially on whether power sharing agreements reduce violence or not. And to me, this seems kind of somehow, I mean, as an outsider, this seems a somehow ill-posed question. So I wonder whether there is really debate on whether power sharing agreements are useful or are harmful. So
The way I'm seeing this, so the way I would think of it is that some power sharing agreements may work, some may not work. So so the way I would approach the study of power, the effectiveness of power sharing agreements is rather to try and ask why some power sharing agreements work and some power sharing agreements do not work. So what makes a power sharing agreement a successful agreement and what does it make it not successful? So the case studies that are in the paper and you've also shown in the presentation are very useful. So they give you examples of instances like Mozambique and Angola where power sharing agreements work to some extent and others where they don't work at all. So why does it work in one setting and they don't work in other settings? So to say that on average, power sharing agreements some work is kind of obvious. So it's kind of, I think if the paper would benefit if you were able to dig a bit more into explaining why some power sharing agreements work whereas others don't. And to some extent, of course, this is something that you already do. So the differentiation between comprehensive and non-comprehensive agreements goes exactly in this direction. And that's of course very useful. But I'm wondering whether, coming back to this graph that you've also shown in the very beginning, so power share agreements include different aspects, and different power sharing agreements include different aspects, the power sharing in different domains, and even the comprehensive agreements are not always including agreements covering all of the aspects here. As you see, economic power sharing is present only less than 40% of comprehensive agreements. Justice sector reform that was mentioned is present in 70 or 80% of all power sharing agreements. So I'm wondering whether you could exploit the differences in the components of power sharing agreements to try and tell us something, learn something about what makes a power sharing agreement successful and what does not make it successful. Second issue has to do with identification. So first of all, I liked in the paper the use of this direct cyclical graph to explain the endogeneity issue. I think that's a very nice, and I like in general the increased popularity of these kind of graphs to discuss endogeneities. And then you try and solve the issues as you explained. Basically, you observation. You see the power share agreements are associated with an increase in violence because that's like a classical selection issue. So that there is selection into the treatment. When there's more violence, then there are more incentives to also reach a power sharing agreement. So the way you solve this is to perform a match definitive analysis where countries where a power sharing agreement is reached are matched with countries that are similar in terms of violence intensity before our sharing agreement is signed, but where the power sharing agreement is not reached. So I like this strategy. I think, again, as I already said, I like the clever way in which you use your conflict forecasting tool. I have to say there is some ambiguity in the text about event study definitive, so the terminology is not always consistent, but that's kind of a minor issue. And also a minor issue is that there is no estimating equation, so I would like to see the estimating equation spelled down clearly. But more importantly, my main concern here is that even after you do this matching, the treatment is still endogenous. So otherwise, if these countries are really identical, why don't they both reach a power sharing agreement, right? So the fact that two very similar countries, one reaches a power sharing agreement and the other one does not reach power sharing agreement tells us something about the countries themselves. So what the results tell us very clearly is that if a country with a high violence level reaches a power sharing agreement, then violence decreases relative to an equally violent country without a power sharing agreement. That's exactly what you show very clearly, and that's something that is obvious. But then the actual question is, does the country has signed agreement see a reduction in violence because of the power sharing agreement, or are the conditions that make the power sharing agreement possible that are conducive also to less violence, potentially even in the absence of a power sharing agreement? So I am kind of puzzled by the by whether we can really say that to what extent we can say the Paris Agreement causally determine the reduction in violence or not. My last point has to do with the structure of the paper, with the way you tell in the paper what you have done. So the focus of the paper from the abstract, especially from the abstract, and to a very large extent also in the introduction, is largely on the effect of power sharing agreements on violence, right? And I think this is kind of underselling what you're doing, because as I said, I personally find that kind of, I mean, the question of whether power sharing agreements do or do not reduce violence, not as interesting as many of the other aspects that then you also deal with in the paper, but you give less prominence in the introduction. So you do much more in the paper than just that exercise. You do this diff in diff with the forecasting error, which I think which I liked a lot. I think it's a very nice exercise, and it would deserve more importance. You study the duration of agreements, which also I think is a very important issue and would deserve more recognition. You analyze the institutional changes that are associated with a drop in violence. Of course, I mean, you can't really, as you have been very clear about, these are just documented associations, but still it is informative, and it goes towards explaining why power sharing agreements may be effective and thus may teach us something about how they should also be designed. So overall, I would give all of these additional dimensions of the analysis much more prominence than you're currently giving, and I would show more clearly the breadth of your study. So somehow you make it seem as a very narrow paper at the beginning, and instead what you're doing is much broader and deserves and this breadth deserves being acknowledged. Also, I like as I already repeated 3 times, so that is really true. I like the use that you're making of your conflict forecasting tool. However, I think that also deserves more attention. So when I was reading the paper, at some point, when you were explaining the data, you said we use our prediction from the conflictforecast.org. And I was like, so what are we talking about? It was unclear to me that you have developed this tool, how you will be using that. So I think this is a contribution itself. I know that comes from another project, but still the fact that you are using that, this setting is a contribution, and it's something that I would push in the paper as also from a methodological point of view, as some as an aspect that may be used by other researchers in the future, and that is probably something, I'm not sure what you were thinking about when you developed your conflict forecasting tool, but perhaps you did not have this in mind when you actually developed that. So that's an interesting and original, as far as I know, use the tool that I would stress some more in the paper. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So it's time for questions. Okay, so Miguel.
Thanks, Miguel Almunia. Very interesting paper, Hannes. Regarding the matching that you do in the end, I think it, and Thomas already kind of pointed to it, it has the same problems that all the matching strategies have, right? Like it's matching on observables. In your case, it's a fancy set of observables with this machine learning model based on news, etc. But it really seems to be missing the unobservables that lead to the agreement, whereas you don't get the agreement. And I think the second thing you showed us, this forecast becoming too pessimistic, kind of shows that there's something else going on. So I think it's that second result is diagnosing that there's a problem with the first one. There's probably so many conflicts, and it's hard for someone who doesn't know about conflict as much to know exactly what's the unobservables you're missing. But I think that that's a significant problem that it would be interesting to understand what leads to agreements and in what conflicts they don't get agreement.
Giacomo.
Thanks, Hannes. It's pretty, actually, even if you had the call, that is very good presentation. So, so one sort of question is, how is this different from double machine learning, for example? I mean, you're basically doing something very close to it. So that is the literature that, in a way, methodologically, that's where you should refer to. So that literature, as you know, Chernozhukov, Susaneri, etc. I mean, they've actually developed a bunch of these tools. Your difference is that you're using forecasting underneath. So you're not using the propensity underneath, but it's actually a forecasting exercise. So the forecasting exercise comes with inferential problems that are larger than the one you typically use in propensity score. So I don't know how you adjust, because I don't think the CSDID you're using actually adjusts for that, because it's not meant to do that. So that is actually an interesting technical problem for the methodology, which I thought you would actually have to push at some point, and it would be very useful for many other people, by the way. Yeah, so that's actually the technical point. I mean, in a way, maybe, yeah. So, we do know that unobservables are going to be determinants of stuff, but is using an exotic model, on my end of things, I would say, look, this is the best we can do in a way, right? So we are feeding in a lot of information into this machinery so that everything that is left out is supposed to be orthogonal. That would be my, help to the answer.
Okay, thank you. Christian?
Very nice presentation, thanks. I might have missed it because I'm still a bit jet lagged, but is there any way that that the heterogeneity of these agreements can be taken into account? There are some, for example, when you negotiate the 10th agreement and the 9 previous agreements have basically given nothing, then you know basically that everybody knows that we're negotiating again, but it's not going to go anywhere. So as I said, I might have missed it, but is there any way that this, like the history can be exploited? Like how many agreements have there been before? How many times? What has each agreement given rise to? And so yeah, that's. I think there's probably something that can be done. If you had the graph where you see Iraq and there are agreements and there are one agreement, nothing works, and the second and nothing works, etc. So probably like the first agreement is really, really important, and it's gonna signal like, how serious are we about this? Can we trust these things? So I think that there might be something to be taken out of the data there.
Okay, Matthias, and then people fall very far.
Yeah, it seems to me, Hannes, that a way of addressing those comments is actually when you match the treated and the controls is not to match them on the propensity, on the forecast of future violence, but on a forecasting model of reaching an agreement. So could you change your forecasting model, and the outcome would be the odds of reaching an agreement, and then you would match those with the same level of odds, those who managed to reach an agreement versus those who did not. And it seems to me that that would address part of the problems that were raised.
Charles?
That the agreement forecast is not believed. Oh, sorry. Yeah. Okay. So it's the pessimism before the agreement is very bizarre or surprising or unexpected. So I was wondering, why is it happening? Is it a fact that people simply want to be pessimistic so they are not upset by the outcome? Is it because the information you access to through your scooping up data is skewed in some way? Maybe is it that your information is not discriminated between good information and bad information? So there might be something going on in terms of the quality of what you scoop.
David?
Yes, 2 very brief points that are kind of going in the same directions as the previous things. So first, I like the contribution of saying I'm going to control, I'm going to match on forecasts. I think that's, I've never seen that point before, actually. It's a good idea. It doesn't solve all of the problems, but it's a really good idea, given how lively the forecasting literature is, I think it's a good. I mean, it's a great contribution of the methodology. And the other thing is, so like also like repeating a little bit on Matthias and Charles a little bit comments too. So what the forecast error analysis is, seems to suggest is that your model is not good at predicting agreements, but because it's looking at the news, but you have news probably about whether people are thinking about an agreement or whether they're like starting to discuss, etc. So maybe, I mean, if you can, parse those pieces of news, maybe that's gonna help addressing some of the comments. Yes, but even like controlling for forecasts that are unconditional on reaching an agreement, that already gets you quite a long way. And I mean, it would be nice to have a clear discussion of, what kind of biases we can take care of and what kind of biases we don't take care of with that methodology. I think that's just to clarify people's thought, I think, given how new it is.
Okay, Roberto.
So, two short comments. So the first one goes in a direction similar to what Tommaso was pointing out, but it complements it. So, since that a very relevant question is not what is happening, so what are the consequences, but what kind of agreements works with respect to others, and complementary to that, what are the different conditions that lead to different kind of agreements. So that is for me really something which is interesting, because in a way it links to the very first paper that we've seen today. So for instance, there is a positive trace shock is more likely to go toward a comprehensive agreement versus partial agreement. So that's something which would be a nice complement of this paper, I think, to at least in the descriptive modification. And then, so again, on the identification, probably is something close to what Giacomo was saying. But so for me, it's not. So I understand what you're doing, but I don't really understand that. So, or maybe it would be quite interesting to see also if what would happen if instead of matching on the forecast, you do something which is more close to a synthetic different diff. So you match on the pre-trends and see whatever differences emerge in your estimates, just to better understand what's going on. So it seems like the first time I see something match on forecast, and it would be nice to see how it compares to something more standard, probably.
Okay, no more questions. So you want to take some minutes? So yeah, 7 minutes. So
yes, okay. So thank you so much for these comments. Let me first explain the pessimism part, because I think there I didn't do a good job before. So what do I mean when I say pessimism? Define a forecasting error, which is you're 5 months before the agreement and you're looking 12 months into the future. That means you have 5 months that are before the agreement and 7 months that are after the agreement. Now, what I'm calculating is the violence, the actual violence realizations in the next 12 months minus our forecast of this total violence. And then if you are entering negative territory, it means that your forecast was much larger than the violence. That's what I'm calling pessimism. I don't think this has anything to do with like people being actually pessimistic. This is really just like saying our forecasting framework, our machine is not seeing it coming. It's basically just blind to the fact. So the way I see it, so this is maybe me speaking to myself in my little room, but what I thought was that I was very interested in whether the forecast error approaches the treatment effect as you approach the time of the agreement, because then you can really say, well, there's really nothing anticipated here. Nobody sees this coming. They agree, and then violence goes down, and the forecast is blind to this. So to me, this is what I'm so excited. Why I'm so excited about this graph. That is kind of like saying there seems to be, at least when we are trying as hard as we can to forecast violence as good as we can, there's no, it goes back to zero, right? You could see that as well. If people are completely, like if the news and everything is kind of hinting very clearly that this will happen, that if you reduce violence, then our machine would pick it up. And then you would see like a U-shape kind of thing where when you, as you approach zero, it goes back to zero. The forecast error then is really gone, right? And I do think that that means something, but let me be very honest. I don't really, I mean, this is one of these graphs. I don't really know what it means. Like this, I find this interesting. I find this fascinating, but like that's where I stand. Let me say one more thing about things I don't know. I think there's a really crazy, interesting problem that we want to tackle in the team going forward, which is if people act on account of our forecast and are good in preventing, then they kill our forecast, right? Because we see high forecast, they do something, and we have a false positive, right? We saw something coming, but people reacted and it didn't happen, right? It's the reverse of a self-fulfilling prophecy. Now, of course, our forecast is already doing that in the past. In the past, we are ignoring policy all the time, right? We are ignoring, we don't have any of these policies that are people doing inside our forecasting framework. The reason is that there's always delays by which policies are released in their coding. If we could be as fast in the coding of policies as we are in the capturing of the news, we could do the following. We could do a kind of double ML where we say, this is the forecast, and this is the forecast with policy 1, with policy 2, with policy 3, and then we would both get better forecasts and causal effects. I think this is where I'm putting my leg down. This is what I really want to do. I think this would be awesome. And I think it's kind of a double ML, and we're far away from that. But double ML with panel data, this is panel data, right? So I think there's a bit of a disconnect between people doing panel data and difference, and people doing machine learning. I have not seen a lot of panel data with machine learning, to be honest. Maybe you're shaking your head, so maybe you know something I don't know. So that would be very good. Then coming back to this point about how does power sharing select into things, and are there heterogeneous effects across different power sharing agreements? Let me reveal something. We tried a lot of things on like heterogeneous effects. We really tried that spider in the beginning. We took it apart. We said like all justice, nothing, where this, no this, and you see the point estimates are different, but like then they're not significantly different. So then how do you write an academic paper with saying like, yeah, this is really hard to kind of in the communication, I think it makes life hard. But we didn't try this, we didn't try what you were proposing, this kind of like sequence. Sudan, for example. Sudan has a power sharing agreement every 3 months. Do the Sudanese really believe that as they're going into this agreement that they are gonna abide by it? But if they haven't done so up until now, I think I'm totally with you. That's really nice. And we have a notion of that because, as I said, sometimes we have one robustness check where we ignore the fact that the window should be whole, like there should be so Sudan generates overlapping windows like crazy, right? So you have like one treatment and then you can't even calculate the window, and then it's already the next one, right? And so there's one robustness check where we say, okay, screw that. We're just gonna do 12 months around, regardless of what happens in these 12 months, right? That's the alternative that we also tried. And we find slightly smaller effects, but makes you believe that maybe you are onto something. So thank you.
Thank you very much. So it's time for another break before the last session. So thank you.